Hello, hidden gems. So much to discuss when it comes to the Richard Allen trial, dramatic closing statements. And when I say dramatic, I mean dramatic. I was in the courtroom for everything and very lucky that I was in the courtroom for everything. Very few people were. It took a village. It was very difficult. We had to have line sitters. A big thank you to Julie as well as Ted and Red last night again, and Julie today. And just I can't even explain how bizarre everything is and the efforts it is taking to get in the courtroom. So I was there again every moment today and was lucky. I was lucky, but I was there. They're only letting 17 people in today. So this is John. It's so good to see you. I guess
Yeah,
maybe I should start with
good
that.
seeing you.
Usually I jump on these lives alone. And so maybe I should say, and by the way, I've got I call you my better half, but that people don't like that because, my equal half, my my other full, because we're each our own person. I don't know how people want to the politically correct way to say that. I have my co-host and who also happens to be my husband here with us, the amazing Dr. John Matthias. And I miss you and I'm so glad to see you. I'm going to go over the day's events today. There is so much going on, but we're going to do it a little bit different today. It's such a big day. The jury is going home for the night. I'll start with that. I'll start with what's going on right now. And I just felt like today it was time to bring you on, John, and to start talking about this. Of course, I convinced you to jump on. We have the time right now. But yeah, I know that you and I also talked about doing something a little bit more for Patreon tonight. John and I feel that's really important. So we're going to go live with some thoughts here. He's going to actually he's going to comment a little bit on the day's events today. So we're going to throw in some commentary with my journalism today from Dr. John. And then tonight we will be doing a Patreon members only episode as well, where John feels you still feel a little bit safer there, as you shared. This is a very polarizing trial, and there's a lot to unpack and break down and talk about. So we'll definitely be doing a good amount of that here, and then on Patreon later. Let me start, as we say in reporting, the lead. What's going on this moment, and then we'll jump back. The jury has been deliberating. They allegedly picked a four-person because Judge Gull said that was their first job, as she gave jury instructions this afternoon before we all left. She told us all that the schedule is as follows, that the jury was going to pick a four-person, and then she suggested that she was going to send them home, and by home to their hotels. They're sequestered around 4 p.m. this afternoon. It sounds like they have already gone home. So they actually left before. So I think that might be a bit of a hint to them needing a lot of time to process all of the evidence. And they will be without electronics and without visits from family. They will reconvene at 9 a.m. Indiana time, Eastern time, tomorrow morning to continue deliberating. I will be outside the courthouse and inside the courthouse while they do that. They can continue deliberating into Saturday. Saturday is a trial day when it comes to the Richard Allen trial, and Sunday is a day off, as Judge Gull said today. So everyone needs a day off. So there will be no deliberating on Sunday, according to Judge Gull. And they will not, though, if they are still deliberating on Sunday, they cannot visit family, and they cannot have electronics. So I think that also this is going to encourage this jury to move forward. The courtroom that we're in, this large courtroom, is going to be closed off, and Judge Gull explained that The jury is in the jury room, but they might need some more space. And so they are going to be able to come and go from the courtroom. And while the jury is deliberating tomorrow or any time that they're deliberating in the jury room, the counsel for both the prosecution and the defense has to be in the courthouse and nearby just in case they need to look at videos or evidence like audio that perhaps attorneys would need to set up for them. So that is happening. And I do have friends right now at the courthouse. Again, the jury has gone home for the night, but chairs are set up outside every hour, hour to hour, day to day, and they will allegedly reconvene tomorrow to continue deliberating. So, and by home, I always say they're home tonight. I mean, wherever they're staying, home is where your bed is. So I mean the hotels where they're staying.
Yeah.
Yes.
Let me just make a comment about how valuable I think it is that the jury is sequestered. So I hope the jury is not accessing outside information, because
agree.
this is a case unlike any I've seen recently where information is so restricted from the courtroom, both in and out of the courtroom. I mean, obviously, reporters are now in the courtroom, like yourself, when you can be, or every day.
Mm-hmm.
But this is a case that, for the most part, seems to be people want to try this case in the court of public opinion more than any, and on social media more than any case I've seen recently. And I think, no doubt, by creators adopting a perspective and a narrative about this case and pushing it out on social media, that will influence public opinion, which presumably could influence or infect a jury pool. So the sequester part, I think, is really important here.
Yeah, I agree. The jury has been sequestered this entire trial. They have had their electronics, and they have been allowed visits with family on Sundays. But they have to answer every day to saying that they're not doing research. We don't know, but yeah, I agree with you.
They have they have access to electronic devices, but they're sworn to say that they're not using them the next day, basically. Is that?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. And then during this deliberation process, they do not get their electronics.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree with you. People, this is a trial that people are wanting to try. In public, with public opinion. I agree.
Yeah. And I think, you and we've done some interviews with people where this very issue has been discussed. People have asked us about the impact of social media on true crime, the impact of true crime communities, Facebook groups, right? And I think this is a really interesting trial where all of that is coming into play, and it's particularly salient because the information is very restricted, right? So I think we see this in other cases, but I think we see it here. It's amplified here because there's no video coming out of the courtroom or audio, right? So people don't have access to information,
Mm-hmm.
which allows creators to push their narratives, whether their narratives are accurate or not, right? Whether they're misinformation or not, they can push that perspective out on social media, and nobody can fact check, or nobody can view, or, I mean, aside from hopefully people like yourself that are taking notes and just presenting what happened, kind of a play-by-play scenario. This case really opens the door to a lot of interesting problems, I think.
Yeah, I agree. And yeah, I agree. It's like without audio or video in the courtroom too, it's like going back to a time many of us might remember, before cell phones and before laptops, where we had to rely on TV reporters, and journalists and newspapers. But the interesting thing is we still have social media, and we still have some new modern technology to get information out there, and we're a part of that, right? And so it's this odd mix of, like, in the courtroom, the lack of transparency, yet we all are still sharing what we can. Oh, 1 second. I need to also, my phone, I just realized, is connected to my computer, and I need to somehow detach my phone so it doesn't call. Forgive me, everyone. Okay. All right. Well, let's start with the day's events. And it's actually, I'm smiling because it's fun to not only be able to tell the chat what's going on and all of our hidden gems, but to tell you, and to be able to, it's almost like being able to talk to you at night, and then this happened and this happened. And so let's start with, all of the families were there. Again, it was a very, very full courtroom, packed. About 17 of us could come in from outside again. I was lucky to be one of them. Again, one of the last. Um, I I kind of showed people the line. It's just, I don't. I will do a whole other show when I'm home about, stories from the Delphi court line. I could do a whole series on that. But Richard Allen. So we got in there. When Richard Allen came in, he sat down. He was actually smiling and laughing with Baldwin before court, talking and drinking a coffee. He had like a to-go cup of coffee and he was sipping it. He had a green shirt on, button down, glasses on his head. And I noticed that Anna Williams, which is Abby Williams' mother, was crying even before court began, and they were passing out tissues to everyone in the family. I also noticed some unique signs on all of the chairs. They've always sort of had it, this is for the defense, this is for the prosecution, but today they had it very specific with the seats they had saved. They had reserved for Libby's family, reserved for Abby's family, reserved for the Allen family, reserved for credentialed media. I mean, everything was very specific. Before court even began, a Kleenex box was being passed around the courtroom on the prosecution side. So between the families of Abby and Libby, and more family than I've ever seen. Grandparents from both sides, some cousins, aunts, uncles. They were there. Judge Gull reminds us not to talk or whisper. And one interesting moment too was then when the defense attorney, Ajay, came up to right in front of me, where a YouTuber was sitting, and handed them a Post-it note, and then went back up and into the box where the counsel's supposed to be, turned around and smiled at them, and they had a moment. I don't know what was on the Post-it note, but it's not like the Chad Daybell trial where counsel could not talk to people in the gallery or make friends with YouTubers. Jury instructions were read by Judge Gull. That was actually the first thing to happen. And Judge Gull explained that that's what she prefers, is to be able to share the jury instructions before the closing arguments. And they were given the copies of the final instructions. And she explained that the state bears the burden of proof, and the state will begin and they will end. Just 1 second. Hold on. Just sorry guys. And so count one, they explain, so he's charged with 4 counts. She says, that State is trying to prove that he has 2 counts of felony murder, meaning that he attempted to kidnap Abby Williams during an attempted kidnapping, and he killed Libby German in an attempted kidnapping. Those are his 2 felony counts of murder, and then 2 counts of murder. And then let's just jump to it. So closing arguments. State of Indiana versus Richard Allen is put up on the screen. So we have a large screen, and it's McClelland doing closing statements for the prosecution. He did an excellent job. And the state of Indiana versus Richard Allen, February 13th, 2017, McClelland starts, is a day that this community will never forget. The day that Abby and Libby went to the trail and they never returned. On February 13th, 2017, Becky Patty was at home with Libby. Her best friend Abby had spent the night playing games and playing with Libby's puppy. A lot of sirens outside. Sorry. Abby had spent the night playing with Libby's puppy, asked to go, and her last words to her grandmother as they convinced her to go to the trail, "Grandma, we will be okay." There was a Snapchat posting. There was a Snapchat posting in the car as Kelsey offered to drive them to the trail. And Kelsey dropped them off around 1:48. When Derek went to go pick them up, Libby's dad, he could not find them. At 3:30, after trying so hard to get a hold of them, and he could not find the girls, he contacted Anna, Abby's mother. After 5, the families decided to call law enforcement. Law enforcement came and everybody started looking. They continued down the drive, knocking on doors, asking anyone if they had seen 2 girls. And they continued down the drive and they spoke to Brad Weber. There was a quick search, nothing. Family and the fire department all came out and started looking. At 7 a.m. on February 14th, they continued until noon, until Pat Brown finds Abby and Libby, and he calls Steve Mullen. Then they find a tie-dye shirt and shoes in the creek. The bodies were hidden. They didn't get too close, but they observed that the girls' necks had been cut. They found the bodies, they processed the scene, they documented the scene. Crime scene photos are shown now on the screen. We are seeing Abby and Libby, how they are found, and then they start showing close-up photos of Abby and Libby and how they were found. And at this moment, people are crying throughout the gallery. Then they show a shoe and a phone covered in leaves, water, and dirt. And they find a cartridge between the 2 girls. Richard Allen, by the way, I point out, is watching all of these photos on the screen. He watches. And then the last video the prosecution shares, that Abby and Libby, wherever, that last video on the phone, they find the abduction. It's the bridge guy video. And now we watch the bridge guy video on the screen. And Richard Allen watches. This video, McClelland says, was taken at 2:13 p.m. on February 13th. I notice at this moment, too, that the jurors are taking a lot of notes. Bridge guy forces them down the hill. You can feel the fear. You can see the fear. He forces them down the hill with a gun. And by the way, I point out this, I am next to Libby's mother, and there are tears everywhere. And Abby's mom will not even look at the screen. I know. Again, crime scene photos are shown. She can't even look. And then they show a screenshot from that last 43-second video. And we see guys down the hill. That's when law enforcement started talking to witnesses. They talked to Rayleigh and Bree, who at 12:25, and this is where they get into the timeline, and they have the timeline up on the screen. Rayleigh and Bree at 12:25 walk towards the Monon High Bridge. At 12:45, they take a picture. They walk back. They talk. They take a photo at a bench, timestamped at 1:26 p.m. She then sees, after that picture is taken, a man on a trail, a creepy guy, angry. He didn't respond, and he looks to be walking with a purpose. And then we heard from Betsy Briggs. Betsy walked to the Monon High Bridge and noticed a man at the first platform around 2 p.m. And we were able to see Betsy Blair's Fitbit on the screen. They have all these proof, all this timeline, and they're putting the evidence on the screen. And then we have Sarah, who was driving near 4 p.m., who says that she saw a man that was muddy and bloody with hands in his pockets, his head down. And of course, McClellan says every one of these witnesses gives a little bit of a different description, but they all said the same thing, that it was Bridge Guy. The Hoosier Harvest Store video confirms that Sarah, Betsy, and Kelsey were all there at the times they said. The Hoosier Harvest video store gets the timestamps of all of their cars. Christopher Cecil does a full analysis of what is found on Abby and Libby's phone. And the timeline is as follows. At 1:48 a.m., Libby's GPS location on Snapchat and the health app all shows where they are dropped off, what time, and as they head to the trail. The Snapchat gets the GPS locations. The last video is at 2:13 p.m. and it maps Libby's location and movement after that video. At 2:32 p.m., the phone stops and there's nothing in the health app. There's no movement. And he demonstrates now on a map on the screen with a pointer each timestamp. At 12:25 p.m., Bree arrives and starts walking towards the Monon High Bridge. Bree arrives at 12:25. At 12:43 a.m., Bree and Rayleigh arrive at the Monon High Bridge at 12:43. They turn around and they'll go towards the Freedom Bridge. At 1:26, Bree takes a photo of the bench. And then they run into the guy. And then at 1:46, Betsy passes the Hoosier Harvest Store surveillance head, and that is, let's see, hold on, pause. And then they run into Bridge Guy. And then we go to Betsy, Betsy passes the Hoosier Harvest Store on her way to the Monon High Bridge Trail at 1:46. At 1:48, Kelsey turns around and heads back after dropping the girls off. That's at 1:48. At 2 p.m., Betsy reaches the Monon High Bridge and she sees a man on the first platform that turns around. And then on her way back out, Betsy sees Abby and Libby walking towards the bridge. At 2:13, the video begins and Libby took of them being kidnapped. And then at 2:32 p.m., the phone stops moving. At 3:56, Sarah is seen traveling past the Hoosier Harvest Store, and that is when she claims to see a man muddy and bloody on the side of the road. Well, we know, McClellan says, that Bridge Guy kidnapped them, and after the kidnapping, they are dead. So who is Bridge Guy? Because Bridge Guy is guilty of felony murder. Fast forward, McClellan says, to 2022. Dawn Dolan's lead sheet is found by Kathy Shank. And she notices that there is a man who claims that he was on the trail between 1:30 and 3:30. There is a man that was on the trail. Tony Liggett is given the tip, and this indicates Bridge Guy. So they follow up on the tip with Steve Mullins. It's Richard Allen. They verify the info and they call in Dan Dolan. He had copied the info of Richard Allen and has a driver's license. And they're showing this again on the screen. All the evidence they're showing on the screen. So they show Richard Allen's driver's license that Dan Dolan's copied when he interviewed him the first time back in 2017. Richard Allen owns a 2016 Ford Focus, and it is the only one registered in Carroll County in 2016 and 2017. Tony goes to CVS where Richard Allen works, and he takes photographs to compare the pictures of Richard Allen's Ford Focus to the Hoosier Harvest store, where they find a car that matches Richard Allen's and confirm the time he was there. On October 13th, 2022, Tony Liggett's, they call Richard Allen and they bring him in for an interview. Richard Allen confirms during that interview that he is wearing the same clothes as Bridge Guy. During this moment in court, Richard Allen is shaking his head. When McClellan says Richard Allen confirms he is wearing the same clothes as Bridge Guy, he shakes his head. Richard Allen says he went to the Monon High Bridge just like Betsy saw a man on the first platform. Richard Allen says he went to the first platform. Richard Allen says he saw 3 girls and no one else. Richard Allen lies in 2022 about the times that he was there. Richard Allen begins to be angry during this interrogation. He refuses a search of his phone and refuses a search of the house. He states, if that photo of Bridge Guy was taken with the girl's phone, it's not me, end quote. We find a ton of knives in his house, a basket of knives and box cutters. We find a cartridge in a Hope box of pictures and a Hope box of pictures. We find a 40 caliber 6 Sauer. We find his Ford Focus, a blue Carhartt jacket. It's the Bridge Guy starter kit. And that's in quotes. He said, we found at his house, in quotes, the Bridge Guy starter kit. The only Winchester round he had was in his Hope box, the same caliber and brand found in his Hope box. He has photographs of the Monon High Bridge showing that he is familiar with the area, taken over the years. We extracted several of Richard Allen's devices. He had so many, but one was missing, one device. And the name and they had the serial number to this phone. And the one phone he was missing was from 2017, where he would have been using it that day. They have Google searches from April 17th of that year of him saying Delphi, Indiana News. Delphi Google searches with his email address, Delphi, Indiana News, followed by Should I Die Now, followed by Die Now, followed by Die Now, and Die. Melissa Oberg then took the bullet or the cartridge found at the scene between the girls and said, and her findings were that it all matched Richard Allen's gun, that it was cycled through the gun found in Richard Allen's house. Melissa Oberg says that the extractor, ejector, and chamber face all matched. This was confirmed by a coworker who happens to be president of AFNI. We have all heard about AFNI, McClellan says, and she testified that she has never been wrong. He used the gun to get the girls to comply. Richard Allen became angrier as evidence. You saw how he tried as evidence came out in the interrogation. And McClellan stated this, which is really interesting. And you saw, McClellan said, how he tried to manipulate his wife, Kathy, how he said to her, you know that I'm not the person that did this. You know. He confirmed that he racked a gun. Oh, and hold on. I don't know if let me skip that. I'm not sure I have that quoted right. Richard Allen is arrested at that time, and he is transferred after his arrest to Westville Correctional Facility to be kept safe. He was moved there. That could have been it. That could have been all of the evidence we needed. But once he gets there, more starts happening. On April 12th, 2023, he calls his mother. He tells his mother that he has found Jesus. And he tells Kathy, and he says that he has killed Abby and Libby. On April 3rd, there's a phone call to Kathy, and he says that he did it. We now listen to the phone call. And if you guys are interested in those phone calls, we share the detailed of those phone calls in an earlier date. Then we listen to him and we hear Ricky say, "Hey," and Kathy say, "Yes, babe, what's going on?" And he said, "I wanted to apologize. I did it. I did it. I killed Abby and Libby." Kathy says, "No, you didn't." He says, "Yes, I did." Kathy says, "No, you didn't." He says, "Yes, I did. Yes, I did." And then he says something that's interesting, John, and I want you to know. He says, "Yes, I did, and I don't know why." And
Yeah.
Kathy's response to that is, "No, you didn't, dear." Anything you want to say right now? Or should I keep going?
Let me just jump in. That's interesting. I talk a lot about on our channel. I talk a lot about how one of the last questions I ask perpetrators and offenders is, why do you think you did this? Why do you think you committed this crime? Even if they're in denial, by the way. And but many of them are, many aren't. But I always ask that at the end of every interview I do, because I want to see if they have some understanding, if they have some insight and self-knowledge about why they would have committed a crime. And I'd say 95% of the time, criminals will tell me, I don't know why. They'll say exactly what Richard Allen said, meaning that they're not particularly, they lack self-awareness, they lack self-knowledge, they lack self-reflection, and they generally don't have insight about why they commit crimes. And that's one of the reasons they do commit crimes, by the way, is because of that lack of self-reflection and self-knowledge. It's, psychologists call it mentalization. It's the capacity to step back and think about your actions and their consequences. And many criminals, almost the vast majority of criminals, they lack this ability. They act impulsively without thinking about it. And so I think this is really interesting that he said that, because that's what I hear time and time again from criminals, is they don't know why they committed crimes. It's people have this misperception, I think, that criminals know why they're doing something. A lot of times they don't, and it's because they don't really know, they don't know themselves. They don't have that self-awareness. And so that's interesting to me, because he fits that category of criminals that don't know why. Although I do believe that he provides some clues as to why. He's a self-described sex addict. Those are his terms, right? I'm pretty sure that whatever puts him on that trail over by the old Child Protective Services building, where he hides his car, where he conceals his license plate and parks and hides his car, whatever puts him on that kind of off the beaten path trail, probably has something to do with sex addiction. Your microphone.
John's, I don't know how to say your specialty. I don't know how to, that sounds weird to say this. John is most familiar, as far as criminals you work with, you are most familiar with sex offenders.
I've done hundreds of evaluations with sex offenders for community placement and risk assessments. I've had hundreds of sex offenders in group therapy for what almost 2 decades. So yes, I know that population very, very well.
Tina is asking, when did he say he was a sex addict? He said it on some of the prison, some of the notes. I believe it was Dr. Walla.
Dr. Walla. He talked about it with Dr. Walla.
Yeah.
When he was meeting with Dr. Walla on a daily basis, he disclosed that he believed he had a sex addiction, and he disclosed that he was a victim of sexual abuse as a child.
Yes, that's exactly it. I'll keep going. And we're listening to these in court. And by the way, the volume has been turned up much louder, so those in the gallery can hear it a lot louder. And for those of you that want to know where we talk about all of these confessions too, I will share. And actually, if I believe it was, I know what, I believe it was November 1st that I reported. So November 1st, my live from November 1st, I actually talk a lot about all of these confessions.
I want to make another observation here, by the way, that's really important. And that is that Richard Allen makes that pivotal confession to his wife on April 3rd. He wants his wife to hear him. He wants his wife to believe him. We've talked about Richard Allen having dependent personality disorder based upon at least 2 psychologists diagnosing him, not me, other people diagnosing him with that. He, more than anything, wants Kathy to hear that confession, to believe it, and to validate him, and she does not. She tells him to stop, right?
Yeah.
The very next day, April 4th, 2023, the very next day after she rejects his confession, he starts exhibiting bizarre and psychotic behavior. That happens to also coincide with meetings, at least 2 meetings with his attorneys who presented all the evidence against him to him around that same time. And so I'm not going to interpret that at the moment, but I think the timeline is very interesting in terms of when he's showing the psychotic behavior and when he's confessing. He's confessing without psychosis at this point. On April 3rd, nobody's noting any psychosis or any mental health issues. It's only the day after that confession that, and again, I guess as a psychologist, these dates, I'm going to look at this timeline a little bit differently in terms of his mental health. The prosecution probably won't see these dates as being as critical to me, but this issue of psychosis and confessions is really important. And so this confession on April 3rd, which they see as pivotal to this case, which it is pivotal, it's extremely important. It occurs before any notation in his medical record of psychosis.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. Prosecution continues on. They explain that it's Harshman that listens to all of these. Oh, so I also note, I have to be honest, I'm listening to the sound. It's higher volume than it's ever been. And I'm listening to Richard Allen talk to his wife and to his mother. And I have to admit that, again, I've always said this, but I do believe that he does sound like Bridge Guy. Does that mean someone else could sound like Bridge Guy? Yes, somebody else could also sound like Bridge Guy. But I do feel like Richard Allen sounds like Bridge Guy as well as others might too. Kathy continued.
They never did, just, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but they never did any type of voice recognition or facial recognition, right? And I presume the reason they didn't do that was because they didn't have enough clarity in the video to be able to analyze that. But given the state of technology these days, I'm a little surprised they didn't attempt that. Me too.
Well, I'll tell you what they did do, but yeah.
Okay.
The defense agrees with you. They brought it up. Yeah, agree. Kathy says they messed up your meds. He says, I did it. Kathy says they are screwing with you. There is something wrong. They are messing up your meds. And then Richard asks, is there a way to talk to Dad? And she says, they are screwing with you. And she is crying. And he says, I did it. No, you didn't. Why? Oh, no, you didn't. Why do you say that? Kathy asks. And Richard Allen says, because I did it. And then she says, you're lying. And she starts crying. And then he states, I just wish they would kill me and I could apologize to the families. And then Kathy says, don't talk like that anymore. Okay. McClelland then says, unprovoked, unpressured, and on his own free will, he states, Kathy, I did it. And then McClelland continues on. And then he said the warden testified. And the warden said, he said to the warden.
Let me interrupt you just quickly.
Please.
I want to reiterate something I said earlier about this confession. and how important it is. And that is because this is really important. You have someone with dependent personality disorder who, more than anything in his life, he wants to please his wife, Kathy. She's his rock. He wants her to love him, to be there for him, right? He finds stability in his wife. And so when he confesses to her and she rejects him, somebody with dependent personality disorder, you'd almost always expect them to say, okay, I'm sorry, you're right. You're right. You're right, I didn't do it, right? But he doesn't do that. Instead of trying to please her and tell her what he wants her to hear or what she wants to hear from him, which would be, you're right, I agree, don't leave me. Like the underlying message with dependent personality disorder is, please don't leave me, please don't reject me, right? That's the underlying message of that particular disorder all the time. And here you have the person who matters most to him, and she's saying, stop, they're getting to you, they're affecting you, this isn't right. But he keeps going. This is so important because he wants to confess so badly, and he wants to be honest and truthful so badly that he tells the one person he loves the most and needs validation from, he tells her, no, you're wrong, I did this. That's a courageous moment for Richard Allen, and it's a brutally honest moment for Richard Allen because he's going against the grain and he's going against the very person that he's seeking validation from. And I think it would be hard, putting aside the issue of guilt or innocence, it would be hard to discount that confession. Based upon his psychological state and personality, when he says this, when he tells you he did it, and he persists and he won't take no from his wife to stop, that's compelling. I don't know how you can get past that. So I just wanted to add that, people can weigh in any way they want, but that's a moment of brutal honesty from Richard Allen. And the reason he's being honest is because his motivation in confessing is to seek some type of emotional catharsis. This is creating a lot of guilt and shame in him. He wants to unburden himself. He wants to get it off his chest. He wants to tell people what he did because it's weighing heavily upon him, especially with his conversion to Christianity. He's seeking some type of redemption. And that, I think, makes that makes these confessions really compelling, in the sense that you can try to discount them by saying he's psychotic or mental health issues or that he's being tortured. But this particular confession on April 3rd, 2023, before he showed any signs of psychosis, is powerful and it's brutally honest. And I would say if you don't think this is honest, then give me an argument. Tell me why this is not. Tell me why this confession is not to be believed.
I will keep going. And this is the next thing. And I actually don't think you've seen this, John, and I will share it on the screen. McClellan then says his next confession comes with the warden.
Oh, by the way, just let me back up quickly too. I want to make a comment about Bridge Guy, because there's a piece of evidence you pointed out today that I didn't know about, and that is that during that first interview with Richard Allen, he confirmed that he was wearing the same clothes.
Yeah, he said he was wearing like a black or blue jacket and jeans. And then he went through about 3 different possible shoes he was wearing: army boots, tennis shoes, or
But think about that for a moment. So in the first interview with Richard Allen, he says, he basically says he's wearing the exact same clothes or the same clothes as Bridge Guy. And he says he's on the bridge around the same time that the girls are abducted. Like, isn't that pretty close to an admission of sorts? I don't know. I mean, maybe not, but
Yeah.
if Bridge Guy's your murderer and he said, look, I'm wearing the same stuff as that guy. I mean, he had not seen the picture, obviously, but he describes wearing the same clothes. And then later, when they do a search of his home, they find the same jacket. I mean, they don't know for sure the jacket Bridge Guy's wearing, but they find a jacket that matches Bridge Guy's jacket, which essentially is what he said he was wearing. Right.
Yeah.
So that's interesting to me that he basically says to me, it's an admission of sorts saying, I'm wearing the same clothing. I'm on that bridge. Right. Like, isn't that kind of an admission? I don't know.
After this confession, McClelland went on to explain that he then told the warden that he was ready to confess. And we saw the letter that Richard Allen wrote on the screen. And while we don't have that letter to show you, we do have this, and I've put it on the screen. And John, I don't believe I've even showed you this.
I've seen this. Yeah. I've seen this because I saw some of the evidence that was released publicly. Yeah.
So today our team at Fox 59 was able to view this document, and it's an exhibit of Richard Allen's handwritten confession to the murders of Abby Williams and Libby German. Our team got permission from the special judge, Marianne Voorhees, to make and use this recreation on air. I did see the real one today, and I can say that it looks very much like this one. This is a recreation. I saw it on the screen today, and McClelland brings it up. So he says, when he's ready to confess, he writes the warden. And then this letter shows up on the screen. It says, I'm ready to officially confess to killing Abby and Libby. I hope to get the opportunity to tell the families I am sorry. And then McClelland, in his closing statement, then goes on to Dr. Walla. He goes, Dr. Walla, on April 5th, 2023, Richard Allen confesses to Dr. Walla. He says, I killed Abby and Libby. He shares with her that he did it on his own and that he made sure that they were dead because he didn't want them to suffer. He explains that he didn't know why he did it. There's that again. He didn't know why he did it, but that it was sexual. His motive was sexual, and it was a selfish. He's always been a selfish and a coward. And what he did was that he got scared. And so he took their life to preserve his own. He feels guilt and wishes he could go back and change that action. I killed them all by myself. I'm not crazy. I'm only acting like that. But I want to go to that. So again, I just want to point out that in this confession that Dr. Walla wrote notes on, he says, I don't know why I did it. And I underline that again. It was sexual. The motive was sexual, but he has always been selfish and he is a coward. And he got scared, and that is why he took their life so he could preserve his own. But he does feel guilt, and he wishes he could go back and change his actions. Do you want me to keep going?
Yeah, I mean, so this is consistent with everything I just said, that he's a self-described sex addict. He's now telling you his motivation. It's sexual. He's telling you he feels guilt. I think, by the way, he's the most interesting thing you just said is he said, I'm not crazy. I'm only acting like that. He's telling you he's malingering in terms of his behavior.
In terms of his behavior. Because, yeah, we're going to have to, yeah.
He's not malingering on the test he took. later, but he's malingering in terms of, I mean, he says it. I don't know why don't people believe what he's saying? I mean, again,
Let me keep going. Yeah, I'll keep going.
I'm not weighing in here on guilt or innocence. The jury will do that. That's
Right.
always up to the triers of fact, but we're just repeating what he said.
So let me keep going with all the prosecution's closing statements, because then they explain that he confesses on April 7th. He confesses on some other April dates I don't get. There were so many. He confesses on, I think it was like 13th. There were some others I didn't get. Then he confesses on April 22nd, April 23rd, April 26th, April 29th. On April 29th, he says that he used a box cutter that he stole and he left in the trash at CVS. He explains on this April 29th confession to Dr. Walla that he was actually planning to the girls, that word, to wrap the girls, but he got scared. He panicked. He took them across the creek and he killed them instead in a hidden area. He tells Walla that he wants to confess and tell his story. And he says that he saw his parents that morning. They were going to go to lunch. He bought a 6-pack. He drank 3 beers. He bundled up and then he laid in wait. He saw the girls. He followed the girls. He left a cartridge. Oh, he took a cartridge with him. He ordered the girls down a hill. He thought that they were older than they were. He saw a van. He got scared. He crossed the creek and cut their necks. And he kept off the trail to not be seen. And he continued living his life because he had not been caught. And then they say that he also confessed to his mother and Kathy, and they reiterate again. And we listen to more phone calls. And we listened to a confession on May 10th. And Richard says, I need you to know I did this. And I did it. I killed Abby and Libby. On 5/17, he states, I'm just worried that you guys aren't going to love me because of the fact that I did it. Mom, I wouldn't sit here and tell you I did it if I didn't do it. Those were the 2 quotes on the screen, but then we actually listened to a recording and we listened to him talk to his mother on the phone. And he says to his mom, did Kathy tell you that I did it? His mom says, we aren't going to discuss this. And then says, we love you. And Richard Allen says, do you love me regardless? And his mom says, yes. Richard Allen says, is Kathy okay? His mother says, Kathy is okay. We have been holding each other up. I just worried that you're not going to love me if I say I did it. His mom says, Richie, you're not in a good place. I love you. And then they continue. And there's a moment where he says, you know, Richie, you're not in a good place. I love you. And then he says at one point, it does matter when I did it. Oh, she says, you're not thinking straight. And he says, I did it. His mom says, Rick, don't talk like this. I think they're messing with you. Rick says, no, Mom, they're not. His mom says, I love you. And I know you don't have it in you to do that. Rick says, Mom, I wouldn't sit here and tell you that I did if I didn't do it. Mom, we're not going to discuss it. His mom says, I will love you no matter what. You can count on that. There is nothing you could do that would make me stop loving you. Rick says, that's good to know. His mom says, are you meeting with the therapist once a month? Rick says, no, she comes to see me every day. Mom says, that's good to hear. Rick says, gotta go. And mom says, okay, I love you. And then there are more calls on June 18th and June 21st. And on February 4th, 2024, it says, he states, I am sorry for killing the girls. And that was in after he'd been transferred to Wabash. And then Harshman says, McClellan continues, that he had listened to over 700 phone calls and details in Wallace's notes. Richard Allen says, and after Harshman, so after Harshman listened to the 700 phone calls of Richard Allen, that's who listened to him, and read all of the details in Dr. Wallace's notes, he heard about the confession. He saw this note in Dr. Walla where Richard Allen was scared after he saw a van, and he wanted to follow up on that note because 625 turns into a private drive. And they wanted to find out who owned a van in 2017 that perhaps Richard Allen saw. And so they called Brad Weber in for an interview. He saw Brad Weber really quickly, pause. Really quickly to a person asking me something, there's a lot going on. Yes, a hard no. Sorry guys, I have to cancel something because I'm on this live with John. And so I'm telling somebody who's helping me, a moderator, yes, hard no. Okay, 625 turns into a private drive. We found out that he owned a van in 2017. He called Brad Weber in for this interview, February 17th, 2017 interview. Brad Weber says that he left work at 2:02 p.m. and he got home at 2:30 p.m. on February 13th, 2017. Brad Weber testified here that he got home around 2:30. Brad Weber was driving a van, and the route he took was the exact time Richard Allen would have been there with two girls. This is something only the killer would know, a van. Harshman listened to 700 phone calls, and he listened to Richard Allen's rate, his demeanor, and his tone. And he listened to all of the mundane stuff. He watched the video on Liberty German's phone, and he states, that is Richard Allen's voice. Bridge guy is Richard Allen. Count 1, murder. Richard Allen is bridge guy. He killed Liberty German. He forced Abby and Libby down the hill. He slit their throats. He waited to make sure they were dead, and he left behind his calling card, the bullet, or the cartridge, excuse me. On February 13th, 2017, McClellan shows the Snapchat, once again in Abby's phone. Richard Allen stole the youth and the life from Abby and Libby. Bridge guy, Betsy Briggs. Again, Betsy Briggs passed Abby and Libby. Richard Allen lies in wait. Libby watches Abby and a man behind Abby, and something in Libby caused her to turn on her phone. Richard Allen's voice is in the video. This is hard data. It is 2:13 p.m. He uses a gun with an intention to rape them. He gets them to the bottom of the hill, and there is a pause once he gets to the bottom of a hill in their movement. It's for 7 minutes where the health data has no steps. So he starts, in other words, to have his way with the girls, undresses the girls, and then that's when the van scares him. And at this moment, it forces the girls across the creek to a wooded area where he kills them. Libby is still nude and Abby partially dressed. Libby is partially alive. He cuts Abby's throat and watches her die slowly. And for 5 years, he lives among us. But he left behind a cartridge and Libby's phone. And if that's not enough, we have his confessions. Over and over and over, and he walks us through how he does it. He gives us the details only he could have. He is bridge guy, and he killed Abby and Libby. Counts 1 and 2, felony murder. Counts 3 and 4, murder. They conclude, and we have a break. And that is the closing arguments of the prosecution. Want me to keep going with the defense, or is there anything you want to say first?
Well, I want to reiterate that the same thing he did with his wife, he did with his mother in terms of his confession. That his mother is also saying, his mother says, we aren't going to discuss this. So this is his confession from May 17th, 2023. One of the common themes in his confessions is he wants to know if they'll still love him, which again, that's completely consistent with dependent personality disorder, which was his diagnosis, one of his diagnoses. That more than anything, he wants to know that he'll still be loved. He did it, but still love, right? That's dependent personality disorder. But in spite of the fact that his wife and his mother are telling him, no, don't talk. And I've seen some of the chats saying, why are they doing that? It's a great question. The reason they're shutting him down is because they're in denial. They don't think, in the case of his mother doesn't think that her son is capable of that. And his wife doesn't see her husband as a murderer. And so they're completely in denial. They don't want to deal with the reality that one, that somebody's son might be a murderer, and two, that your spouse might be a murderer. So they're trying to protect him. One of the interesting elements of personality disorder is precisely that typically in relationships where someone is dependent or has dependent personality disorder, one of the parties, in this case, the spouse and or mother or both, feel like they need to protect their child or their spouse. Because the independent personality disorder, that person pulls for that. That person pulls for this sense of being taken care of. They're dependent, right? They need that sense of dependency. So if you have a child that's overly needy and dependent, typically, a parent may overcompensate and overprotect them. And that's what's going on here. The reason why the wife and mother are acting overly protective and trying to shut him down is because, number one, they can't believe it, but it's also a function of their relationship. It's a function of an overly dependent relationship. So systemically in their relationships, they're used to this playing this role of the protector, the overprotector, right? That he's the one in a dependent relationship. He's the one they need to take care of. And so they're stepping back into that role of protector and overprotector. And they're trying to get him to shut down because that's how they treat him. That's what you do. That's typically what you do with someone who would be diagnosed with dependent personality disorder. Independent personality disorder, the dynamic is someone saying, love me, care for me, take care of me. And the other party will say, okay, I'm going to love you. I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to coddle you. I'm going to treat you with kid gloves. And so that is the dynamic. Now, a lot of people are probably saying, well, okay, but he wants to confess. Why don't they just let him confess? Why doesn't he confess? And his wife or mother say, look, I understand now you did this. I want you to go make a full confession and let's take a plea deal. Let's take a plea deal so you're not put to death or whatever the outcome is. They don't do that because they're in denial and because they're playing into his dependency, which is his diagnosis. They're playing into his personality disorder. They've done that his whole life. And as a matter of fact, I'd go further and say that my guess is that his mother plays a role in raising a child with dependent personality disorder. And one of the elements of that is being overly protective with your child. So that's the dynamic they've had their whole life. You're just seeing it you're putting it under a microscope here, because you have a child who wants to confess. I mean, he's an adult now, but a child who wants to confess, and a mother who won't let him, because her dynamic and everything she knows about raising her child is, my child needs protection because he generally can't take care of himself. He's super needy. He's super depressed. He's super anxious, and I'm going to be his protector. That's what's playing out there. In a normal relationship where somebody's not as dependent, what you would get is a spouse saying, that's a horrible thing you did. I can't believe you committed murder. Let's go tell people so that you can, let's confess to the warden or whoever, confess on video, which people still wouldn't believe, by the way, but go confess to the warden and plead guilty, and let's take a deal because you did this crime. And also, I mean, in addition to the fact that this guy, his motivation to confess is valid. He wants to confess because he wants a catharsis. He wants to unburden himself. He wants to be, attain some level of peace. His motivation is not to deceive someone. I mean, in a false confession, the motivation essentially is, the reason why someone would give a false confession under coercion is they want to stop the pain. They want to stop what they're experiencing in that moment. He does not want to do that. The motivations behind most false confessions are not this. They're not catharsis. And also, the other thing that's really hard to ignore here, the sheer volume of confessions is overwhelming. 60 plus confessions. Like, you can convict someone with one confession. You can convict someone with one valid, honest confession that's not coerced. Juries do that all the time. But here you have 60 plus confessions where people are like, I don't know.
Yeah.
He's not telling the truth. He's being coerced. He's tortured. Like, 60 confessions? You only need one confession to do the trick. What's going on here? My question I asked on Patreon, which I'm not going to answer here, but we will answer it later on Patreon. My question is, when somebody tells you the truth, when somebody confesses to something repeatedly, why don't you believe him? Right? Why don't you believe him? Why don't you take him at his word?
Well, the defense will tell us why. Maybe we should jump to their statement. The defense will tell us why we shouldn't. So, let me tell you a little bit about what happened on the break before we jump to the defense. I thought the defense did an excellent job. I thought the prosecution did an excellent job, and the defense did an excellent job. And I said as much on my lunch live. But there was a break at this moment before the defense. And I admitted at the lunch live where I am, there are a lot of varying opinions in the courtroom, and I deeply suspect that the jury might be torn right now. Nobody knows, right? We can only speculate. I've been wrong about juries before, most juries actually, so don't take my word for that. But I suspect they're torn right now, that at this moment, it's a hung jury, but they're going to deliberate tomorrow. And so I'm just one person in the courtroom, but I admitted as much on my YouTube live that the state's case and the evidence that I have seen, now that I have listened to it all and seen it all, like I feel like Richard Allen is guilty. That's as someone who sat in the courtroom every day, listening to all of the evidence, that's where I am. And again, I am just one person in there. So I felt really good after I felt like the prosecution really brought it home and it made sense to me. And I saw some family members and I shared with them that I thought the prosecution did a great job and it was very clear to me. And I just want to share that because now we're going to jump to the defense. And so again, this is still before my lunch live. It was done by Rosie. There are excellent attorneys on both sides of this. McClelland's incredible. Rosie's an excellent attorney as well. Rosie states, jurors, you have been here for 17 days of testimony, evidence, witnesses, 200 to 300 pieces of evidence, exhibits, and videos. Our time to try to summarize theories of this case, and all while the state trusts that all they've shared is more important than what we're going to share today. The state has provided a broken timeline, bumbled ballistics, and fumbled confessions. 3 men, by the way, at the end of the jury are taking frantic notes, and jurors took notes throughout the defense's, I want to say, entire closing statements. And now I keep seeing now 4 jurors are taking notes. I'm going to continue with my flow of closing arguments from the defense, but just so you know, throughout the entire thing, I say 4 jurors are taking notes. These 2 men are specifically taking a lot of notes. There were a lot of jurors taking notes, and about 3 jurors in particular that I saw took the most notes from the defense. The defense continues. Rosie, the most important thing is what the state didn't tell you and what we had to tell you time and time again. Their refusal to have a height analysis done on the video. Why not? Why not spend the money to get a height analysis done? The Ford Focus being a 2016, why didn't I not tell you all the other cars that it could have possibly looked like all the other years? The hatchbacks, why didn't they tell you? And then what about the man who saw something unusual when he was in the area? We had to tell you this. The Betsy Blair story, we told you through cross-exam. We had to be the ones that told you this, that Betsy Blair saw someone that was youthful and boyish and not short, that the vehicle she saw when she left was entirely inconsistent with Richard Allen's vehicle. Sarah Carbaugh, she didn't tell you her whole story in cross-exam. First, she said that the man was muddy and bloody, and then she said it was a tan jacket, and then she saw Bridge Guy and said, yes, that's him. When you hear testimony or receive evidence so preposterous, you should discount it. It's what they didn't tell you. David McCain, we had to call him to the witness stand. He was there that day. He is a believable man who is taking photographs that day. He has a camera and he is on the bridge between 2 and 3 p.m. and he spent time on the bridge. Shelby and Cheyenne, 2 more witnesses. They were there 2:30 to 3:30. Shelby and Duncan around 2:50, and he checks his notes to make sure the time. The state did not offer these witnesses. Rick's version of his route, Richard Allen's version, they tried to put Rick on a route that best fits their narrative, but that's not what Rick said. I suggest to you, when you go back to deliberate, pieces of evidence that I suggest are that you digest are the interrogations. I believe that these 2 pieces of evidence are so important. How did Rick Allen handle this situation during the interrogations, being interrogated for murdering 2 little girls? Brad Weber's lab results from his gun, they cannot be excluded. Brad Weber's yard, you see significance of sticks. We offered that, not the state. Brad's statement to police, he said that he drove home right after work, but he actually interviewed in 2017 with Agent Poole that he did not go home, that he went, and you heard that from us. There were phone calls that were brought up. You might find some of them suspicious if you really look into them. The FBI parting ways in the midst of the investigation. Doug Carter acknowledges issues and a separation. The sticks that were not recovered at the crime scene, and they had to go back and collect them 2 months later. They had to collect those items. And then videos from Westville. For 13 months, Richard Allen sat in an isolated cell. All he wanted to talk about is nothing of substance, although he had been shackled to take a shower or to see a doctor. Why wouldn't they want to see the truth? You, jury, need the truth. Then these infamous photos, and he shows photos of the bullet or the cartridge. This magic bullet, as the defense called it, was collected and clearly the catalyst for Richard Allen's arrest. He was trying to leverage Mr. Allen in that Holman interview, in that interrogation video with Holman. He was trying to leverage this bullet with Mr. Allen because without that cartridge, he's not even there. Richard Allen isn't even there in that interrogation room. And at the end of that day, basically what they got was, you should just believe Melissa Oberg. And they did not offer up the photos. Jury, use your common sense. And then there's the Cellbrite data. What they didn't tell you was that at 5:45 p.m., someone plugged in an accessory. At 10:32, another audio output was recorded in the same situation. At 4:43 a.m., no explanation has been offered up as to why text messages came into Libby's phone. Also, the chapter of desperation that has unfolded over the last 2 years, they got that magic bullet and they arrested Richard Allen. And that van, that one unique fact that they mined out of one therapy note. And what did they find? Running a search on Brad Weber. He was contacted, though, and Mr. Weber himself sent some text messages to prove his case, but the defense has never seen those texts. We have never seen that interview that he had with Agent Poole. He testified that he typically drives the Subaru to work and doesn't go home after work. In 2016, from 2017, it has taken them 7 years to figure this out. The DNA, we saw that hair strands, items that were collected 7 years ago. They are still trying to figure it out. Admissions of internet searches. October 2022, searches by Mr. Allen. There is no proof of fact that they were done by Richard Allen. It could be someone else using his email address. The searches for a movie, let's convict half of Carroll County. We're desperate. The state, having realized that the headphones were plugged in, Christopher Cecil to offer up some fast food. The Google searches, desperate, absolutely desperate. And then Dr. Kaur, he's who did the autopsy. Between time of deposition and the time he testified, ta-da, hey, it might be a box cutter. He had 3 meetings with the prosecutors, but offered no supplemental report. Nothing. This is desperation at its finest. And now the timelines. 3:55 to 3:57. Sarah Carbaugh. We have an image of her car driving. And let me suggest that it is not unreasonable to go back in that room, that jury room, and say, I don't think Sarah saw anything. The phone record on February 14th under Abby's body, none of these things are consistent with what we saw in the cell phone data. At best, is nothing consistent with Sarah, The phone that they received on 2/14 under Abby's body, none of these things are consistent with what Sarah said. At best, or at worst, Sarah's memory was created and offered an offer to her after they showed her a photo. This is what happens with lineups, and they ask someone to identify witnesses. It's suggestibility. And why are Shelby Hicks and Mr. McCain and Shelby and Cheyenne and Daniel Pearson not part of the timeline? Dave McCain says he sat on that bridge and he heard nor saw nothing. There was an older man at the end taking notes. They heard nor saw nothing. Dr. Kaur says the girls could have died possibly later, according to his autopsy. There were no vocal cords cut. They could scream, but nobody heard anything. To anyone else, the state doesn't want to talk about it. February 13th. Hold on. February 13th. They want you to accept this theory as accurate, that they were rushed downhill through woods, undressed, wounds afflicted, while the other girl was also controlled. And then somehow he kills the other girl, and sticks were placed in an unusual form on the bodies, and then the body moved. This suggests multiple actors. They say this was done by a 5', 5" man without a sound or trace. Then the girls are found. Richard Allen calls law enforcement and says he'd be happy to help. And he speaks to Dan Dolan. And Dan Dolan doesn't think anything unusual back in 2017. But all of a sudden, on October 13th, 2022, he's taken to the station. And he stood there and he told them he didn't do it and that he cooperated. And he cooperated with them. And then on October 26th, Richard Allen goes in again, cooperates again in the face of those lies. And his voice, being the one on video, he asserts his innocence over and over. The state wants you to believe that because the tone of his voice changed a bit, he's guilty. That's insulting. I would suggest that anyone in any interrogation would finally start to get frustrated. And then police use his wife, detectives use his wife as leverage. They bring Kathy in and Richard Allen defends her. The magic bullet, let's talk magic bullet. Collected under leaves, poorly photographed. A cartridge shows up at a lab. The gun shows up to be tested. It suggests confirmation bias because they've narrowed it down to 2 different guns. Placed in this firearm, marks on test firearms means it's not sufficient to compare. It's apples to oranges. Again, they placed this firearm marks with test firearms that they fired. It is not sufficient to compare. It's apples to oranges. And then does the fire not and then she compares it to a round she fired. This is improperly comparing apples to oranges. It can be done, but it requires more work and research, and you need to explain your work. I put at this moment, the jury is taking a lot of notes during this moment. The ejector, the extractor, and the barrel, she compared them, but only with the ejector, nothing with the extractor. And then, if anything should upset you about this, hold on. And then, let me follow my notes. And then if there's anything more that should upset you about this, let's talk about these 2 photographs. And he places photographs on a screen. Where in the hell do these photos match? The subclass, the characteristics, the sequence, the undertone. And he's referring to the microscopic photos of the bullet. This is a subjective game. You might ask, well, why didn't the defense have the cartridge tested? Maybe it was because the work was so poor. False confessions, let's talk about those. This is unprecedented. The warden acknowledged that in the last 25 years, he'd never had a pretrial detainee in the Westville Correctional Unit. Dr. Walla also acknowledged the same. Dr. Martin, I think, told us the same. By the way, he did it in his testimony. I noted that. Mr. Allen was fragile. He has major depressive disorder. Dr. Westcott said, and I missed what Dr. Westcott said, And then Rosie says, they say that he was treated just like the rest, but these are the most heinous individuals in the state, and he was treated just like them. And was immediately placed on S watch, self-harm watch. Research shows that no human can handle the circumstances he did. Eating off floors, mice droppings, ants, being called a child killer and a baby killer by other inmates through the wall. Cinder block walls, concrete floor. Outdoor rec is a cage with a screen on top. And when he got into therapy, in order to transport him to therapy, they shackled him in arms with a belly band and a lead. I call it a leash. And they walked him to a cell to talk to a therapist. This is solitary confinement. Oh, solitary confinement is damaging to anyone when you're held. The evidence is firm. You can only handle so much. 30 days turned to 60 days. 60 days turned to 90 days. 90 days to 120 days. I can keep doing the math, but he was there for 13 months. How much can one human endure? You saw the video of him. Harshman said, he's right where he belongs. Wallace said he was psychotic in March, May, and June. He was getting stuck with meds, antipsychotics, which means that you're psychotic. Wallace says she wasn't even sure. She said, I don't know. Dr. Martin explained the time and place where he could watch that video, and he thinks, pause really quickly, I can't read my handwriting. He could watch the video and he thinks something, time and place. I'm going to have to skip that. What was the medical standard in which these people here were working to keep him alive? That was their medical standard. Keep Richard Allen alive. You should feel insulted. Dr. Gracian, the Harvard psychiatrist that testified, he says false memories start out as false beliefs. Look at the phone call that Richard Allen made to his mom. Rick says, I did it. And then they continue. And then he says, no, I did it. I killed Abby and Libby. And then later down, what does he say? Because maybe I did it. I think I did it. I'm unsure. He is unsure if he called his dad. He thinks, I think I did it. I wish I could say I did it. I don't know. These are false beliefs, according to Dr. Gracian. How do you interpret information? That phone, that cell phone, let's talk cell phone. How do you interpret information? Cell phones have no personality. Cell phones don't have feelings or emotions. It just generates raw data. One simple conclusion to the 5 and 10 time frame, where the car at 5 and at 10, where the car jack or the phone jack, someone put something in there. And he says, quote, someone was using that phone, end quote. The elevation change. You have a map, 65 feet from the bridge to the water. Here's the other side of the map, where Weber drove allegedly halfway down, 30 feet maybe. I don't know. But I don't have to tell you that that private road leads to Brad Weber's home. And at Brad Weber's home, there are sticks. And Brad Weber, he has a gun. The state had 7 years to figure out, and there's no explanation because the phone is essentially right. You need facts, and the state wants you to believe there was a box cutter. It's a common tool. They would want you to see those knives in the house and the box cutter, but no trace evidence on them. Dr. Westcott had an interesting observation. Dr. Westcott was who we talked about the other day, you and I. She noted that the medical notes of her version or summary flowed like a story. But for 4 months, he was in a psychotic state. No man could talk like that. But they showed up on a paper by Dr. Walla. The word bizarre comes to mind, along with Dr. Walla's infatuation with this case. She visited the Monon High Bridge. He was allegedly lying in wait. Does he seem like he's lying in wait in that video? Can you hear that guy or the gun? Or can you see it? They want you to believe he was an alcoholic because he had a few beers that day, but there's no reference to him being an alcoholic. The search for the girl is being called into question. Lay people just trying to help, walking around all over. They found nothing on February 13th. With no leaves on the trees, they did not find Abby and Libby's bodies that evening. They say he was lying in wait. The witnesses say that Richard Allen was lying in wait, walking with purpose, implying he knew these girls. But there's no evidence of this man and these girls, nothing. The clothing they collected, a blue Carhartt jacket. There's a revelation for you. Shocking. A blue Carhartt jacket in Carroll County. The prosecution claims he found the Lord, and that's why he came clean. Well, in a tiny cell with only a Bible, can you blame him? He's not the only man who found God in prison. Richard Harshman identified the voice of Richard Allen, but years and years of tips, hundreds of tips, with people thinking that they knew the voice, but now Richard Harshman is a mind reader? Use your common sense. Speaking of common sense, no witness has said that Richard Allen is Bridge Guy. No electronic, no fingerprints, no shoe prints, and no speck of DNA connects Richard Allen to that scene. Not a trace speck of DNA connects Richard Allen to the crime scene. If he was muddy and bloody, even years later, if he was muddy and bloody in this world, they would find something in his car in 2022. The rules permit me to speak only once. This has been a journey for me, but it has not been as long as a journey for Abby's families or for the Allens or for Libby's family, for Abby's family or for the Allens. And at the end of the day, the state's timeline has crumbled. The magic bullet is nothing more than a tragic bullet, putting Richard Allen in that tragic place. That phone under that young woman's body for hours and hours does not make any sense. Phones don't have personalities. And then he brings up a photo, and it's a photo of a man, a sketch of a man being tortured. Consider this. This here is called a rack. It's a tool used in medieval times to punish people, to interrogate people. But as a society, we have evolved now more subtle forms like solitary confinement, a slower, more painful form of interrogation. Someone should have spoken up. Why was someone not going to say something? This is wrong. Where's the moral compass? You, jury, are the moral compass. Every so often, we are given another course of action. The time is now. That's the power of the state, the power of the government. And now is not the time to step back to the Middle Ages. Now is the time to step forward into the ring and to say, this is not how we function. We're asking you to set Richard Allen free and free from these restraints. And he points to the picture. Thank you. And then it was lunch.
Okay.
I thought they did. I thought they did an excellent job, the defense. And so I guess my point being, I'll just share this and you can decide what you want to say. I shared with you what I said to somebody in the middle of the two. So I was in there. There's a break that we stay in the courtroom for. I talked to a family member. I say the prosecution was excellent. That's wow. Then we have the defense. And then I run outside, and that's when I do my lunch live without talking to anyone. Now you guys can know where I was during my lunch live. Then I come back in. I'm unsure if I'm going to get back into the courtroom. I do get back into the courtroom. I'm sitting there, and a family member of one of the girls comes up to me again, and she says, "And now what do you think?" And I said, "The defense did a really excellent job." And the conversation that we had, she implied that, perhaps the jury, though, will look at logic, but I don't know. There you go. It was, and I shared on my lunch live, honestly, John, I shared on my lunch live that I felt a little bit bipolar, listening to those two things back to back.
Well, first of all, the defense's job is to create doubt, right? The reason we have defense attorneys in this country is it's an adversarial system. Their job is to create doubt to get their client acquitted, and defense attorneys exist to force the state to make their case. So they're doing their job. Did they present sufficient rebuttals to create reasonable doubt? I don't know. I guess the jury will tell us that when they come back with a verdict. I mean, the most interesting element of their case was the ending to me, because clearly they're tapping into something very emotional by putting up a photo of a middle-aged torture rack. Number one, that's completely irrelevant to anything to do with this crime. I guess the presumption is that Richard Allen is being tortured in prison. So as far as I know, he wasn't put on a rack.
Right.
And stretched. And I mean, if you want to know how people were tortured in the Middle Ages, go look it up. They didn't have tablets. They weren't able to talk to their families. I mean, it's a lot of people feel he was tortured. I guess it depends on your definition of tortured. I would say that he felt like he was tortured.
Yeah, I believe that. I think he probably did feel tortured. And yeah, yes, to him, it was torture.
But I think so I talked about this a little on Patreon, that, one of the issues here has to do with the state. And, you just said that the defense ended with that. This perception that Richard Allen is this innocent victim and he's being persecuted by the state for no reason whatsoever, that there's no evidence. Why did they even charge him, right? So I think there's this fear here that the legal system, the judicial system, is out to get people, innocent people like Richard Allen, with no evidence whatsoever, and presumably that if you get Richard Allen, we could, tomorrow we're going to get you. We're going to pull you over for a broken tail light, and we're going to haul you in, and we're going to call you bridge guy, and we're going to arrest you, and we're going to charge you with a crime you didn't commit, right? I think you've got this underlying paranoia here about this persecution complex, about the average person in America is under siege and should worry about being charged with crimes they didn't commit. And Richard Allen is the poster child for this particular view, right? And so that's what the defense is playing up here. That's what they're playing on. That when you present a medieval torture chamber with some guy being tortured on a rack, like, that is not authentic. That is not relevant to this case, right? That they're purely playing on people's emotions.
Correct.
And they're playing on the emotions of persecution of
Correct.
innocent people. It did happen, in the Middle Ages. People that had mental health problems, schizophrenia. Let's take so in the Middle Ages, if you had schizophrenia and you were hearing voices, people thought you were possessed. They would throw you in dungeons. They would, drain your blood, torture you, try to exorcise the demons. right? I mean, that's what they're trying to say. That's what they're trying to say, that there's no due process. There's no evidence that Richard Allen was tortured. He was arrested unfairly. You know, to call the magic bullet a tragic bullet, I mean, yeah, I agree. It is tragic because it's on a crime scene where 2 innocent girls were brutally murdered.
Yeah.
Is it magic? Nope. It was in Richard Allen's gun. It's not a magic bullet. I mean, they're doing what a defense does. The reason there's no DNA on the crime scene is because, number one, it was outdoors. It's a lot harder to get DNA out of a crime scene that's in an area that's in a wooded area where there's rain and it's wet and clothes were put in the creek, right? Like, and then why isn't there blood in his car? Because it's 5 years later. I mean, but I don't know. I mean, they're doing what a defense does. They're doing their job, and they're forcing the state to make its case, and which is how the system works and how it should work. Do I have an opinion about, you know, Richard Allen's guilt or innocence? I mean, probably, but I'm not going to express it here. We'll talk about it later. But the question I come back to here is, and I always talk about this a lot, is weighing evidence. You can cherry pick evidence all day long, and you can make an argument based on cherry picking evidence. You can take one piece of evidence, and I guess we all do this, right? But some evidence counts more than other evidence. Some evidence is stronger and more compelling than other evidence. And whatever evidence you pick, you know, if you argue that he's tortured, you got to show me, because that's not what the guard said. He wasn't put on a rack and stretched and his blood wasn't drained from him. Right? So I guess if you argue psychological torture, you could make that point. But I will say this, though, you know, there's research showing the juries are they're persuaded by the most coherent theory of the case that matches the evidence. So, and I think the defense doesn't really have a theory of the case. The defense's theory of the case is that the state overstepped its bounds and arrested the wrong person and then tortured him, and he confessed because he was tortured, right? That's essentially the defense's theory.
Yeah, it is. There are a lot of questions about that. Pat Brooks, thanks you so much. I just want to say thank you. We'll do a lot of super chats after, but thank you so much.
And I noticed somebody wrote in chat, by the way, I wrote this down because it's consistent with what we're talking about. Somebody wrote, Richard Allen's constitutional rights were trampled on, and that's all that matters. This was written before you read the stuff about the torture rack in the state. So somebody in chat wrote that. That's interesting. That's an interesting perspective, right? Because in my mind, that's not all that matters. He's getting a trial, so his constitutional rights are being exercised. He has an excellent defense team, so his constitutional rights are being upheld. But you know what matters is justice. What matters is are the victims going to have a voice? Are the victims going to get justice? Is this truly, like, a lot of people that agree with the defense, they call this a cold case. Is this a cold case? I mean, people think it is. People think that Richard, there's nothing whatsoever, no evidence whatsoever that you could put out there that would show that Richard Allen is guilty. Everything that you can say about Richard Allen, including 60 plus confessions that were motivated because he wanted a catharsis and he wanted to unburden himself of his overwhelming guilt. None of that matters. None of that matters in in comparison to his constitutional rights, I guess, whatever that means. I mean, you lose constitutional rights when you murder people too, by the way. So the reason why they're holding him in a smaller cell, they call it solitary confinement. I'm not sure if that's accurate, but because solitary confinement, I mean, it differs by prison and it differs on the facility you're in, but solitary confinement is pretty bad. But it's you don't get to talk to people in solitary confinement. Typically, solitary confinement is because you're either so violent or you've acted in such a way that you lose privileges in the general population. That's when you're put in solitary confinement. You're put in solitary confinement to protect the prisoner and to protect the general population. And when you're put in solitary confinement, it's often a type of punishment. It can be. Like in the cases I deal with, it's often punishment. So you don't punish someone by giving them a tablet, giving them a window, letting them talk to their therapist and see their therapist every day, which means he had social interaction. One of the reasons solitary confinement is so damaging to human beings, and it is damaging, it's extremely damaging, is because of the isolation and the lack of human contact. Okay. But Richard Allen didn't have that. Richard Allen had contact with other people. He was free to leave his cell at will. That's not solitary confinement. In typical solitary confinement, you can't leave your cell.
Well, I don't know if it was at will, but when someone came to offer him to leave. But right.
He wasn't, okay. He couldn't
just leave.
The door was locked. It was
right. But if somebody offered it to him.
Right. What I mean is that that a typical inmate in solitary confinement can't say, "Hey, can I go talk to this person?" or "Can I?" Right? So does solitary confinement, under the conditions in which Richard Allen was placed, does that lead to torture and psychosis and like all the right? And I mean, it is complicated because typically a normal inmate will be put in jail. They'll be put in and there's a difference between jail and prison, by the way. Prisons are more difficult and harsher than jails, but typically I've seen some jails that are pretty bad, but it really depends. Typically someone would put in jail until there's a trial or until the case is adjudicated. And then if they're found guilty, they'll go to prison afterwards. And so this is unusual in that sense that he had more restrictions placed on him for sure. But I'm not sure just that alone doesn't mean he's tortured, right? I mean, I think people have this, you have to know more details about this scenario to make judgments, right? Because I think people have this assumption that when they hear solitary confinement, they just assume that he's being put on this torture rack that looks like something from the Middle Ages, and that's not what this is.
Yeah,
he had TV privileges. He chose not to use those, but he was offered TV. Like, I don't know a single inmate that's ever put in solitary confinement in prison. Inmates call it the hole, by the way. I'm going to the hole. I'm going to spend time in the hole. The hole is dreaded by every inmate, almost every inmate. But they're not getting television privileges in solitary confinement. None of them. I don't know a single inmate that's ever been put in the hole that has had television privileges. So I think this is complicated. I think people are creating a scenario. They're
well, we do have a lot of questions about that. Why don't we do this? Let's move forward to after lunch, where we hear the prosecution's rebuttal. It was actually it was short. It was a lot shorter than both these closing arguments, and get to where we are now, which is that the jury in their hotel rooms. So at lunch, I got into the room, the courtroom. I feel very, again, privileged and grateful to have been in there. And Lieutenant Holman is in there, by the way. I noticed a lot of the law enforcement are in there, which they often are during closing arguments. And Holman sits by Kelsey German, and he actually puts his arm around her for a time. And at this moment, I talked to some family members of the victims, and then, of course, the prosecution gets the last word. They get the last rebuttal, and it is McClelland again. And this is what he shares. He says, "I am not here to tell you how I feel. I am here to present the evidence. The defense went through a lot of the evidence will show ... but they haven't shown that. I presented evidence only the killer would know. The state has not done that, or the state has done that. The state presented witnesses who saw Bridge Guy on the trail there. It affirms what Richard Allen tells us, that he is there. He's on the bridge. Libby's phone tells you it happened at 2:13 p.m. The other people weren't there at that time. The phone stopped moving at 2:32 p.m. It was under the body of Abby Williams. We don't know if they screamed before then, but we do know that Liberty was crying because there is a blood outline of a tear. She was crying and she was scared. He left a bullet. The cartridge goes from a crime scene to the lab. And then Melissa Oberg testified that the bullet cycled through Richard Allen's gun. She told you why she thought that, or based her opinion on that. And her results were verified. The defense's gun expert, he didn't write a report. He didn't find any findings. It's not a magic bullet. Unless a magic bullet helps solve a murder, I'll take it. The confessions, the defense repeatedly says words matter. He said a lot of words to a lot of different people. He told Dr. Walla that his attempt was to R them. R-A-P. He thought that the girls were older. Words matter. He trusted Dr. Walla. He told his mom that he trusted Dr. Walla. He called his wife with Dr. Walla in the room there, and he confessed he trusted Dr. Walla. Words matter. Evidence shows that Richard Allen is Bridge Guy. There was something I didn't get. I'm sorry. And then he states, there are two victims in this case, Abby and Libby. They are the victims of Richard Allen. They are more than victims, though. They are heroes. They are who took video. They are who hid the phone. They are who camouflaged the bullet. Those acts by Libby and Abby led to the arrest of Richard Allen. Libby told her grandma that one day, I am going to grow up and I am going to help solve crimes. And that is exactly what she did. And she brought Abby along with her. Thank you. And we did learn that in opening statements that Libby was interested in true crime and that she did want to work in helping to solve crimes. That was what she hoped to do one day. So that was a poignant moment for me. So after that, it was jury instructions and Judge Gull explaining the schedule, which I explained all at the beginning of this show. So that was the entire day. I concluded the day. So now we can just talk.
So I kind of, I said what I think I need to say. If you want to get into some questions or chat, I don't know. I mean, I think that the prosecution's final statement was succinct but powerful. it did take a tremendous amount of courage for them to take video. And by the way, Richard Allen, in his statement, in his interview, he said something to that effect. He essentially said, oh, by the way, if there is a phone with video on it, it's not me. I mean, how would he know that? Who else would know that?
So that's, well, he knew that because the bridge guy video was out. Let me clarify that, because
Okay. That was
let me clarify. The bridge guy video was out, and Richard Allen allegedly called law enforcement after the bridge guy video surfaced, and law enforcement was asking for tips. And then during the interrogation, and I saw the interrogation videos, they asked Richard Allen if he is bridge guy, and his answer, is Gray Hughes Investigate states, is, if the girls took the picture, then that isn't me because I don't know them. And so Gray Hughes actually does want you to know what you think of that, but just for your knowledge, the image of bridge guy had surfaced.
Okay.
And so they asked him, are you bridge guy? And his response was, well, if the girls took the photo, then it's not me because I don't know them. And so it is a curious thing to say. You know, he could say, no, I'm not. I mean, I don't know. It was compelling. Like, why did he just say, well, if the girls took it, it's not me? Why not just say it's not you?
I know. Right. Exactly. Like a normal response, an expected response would be, nope. Right. I think, I mean, not to be critical, but I think the prosecution ended simply but powerfully. They might have, maybe there were a couple things they could have addressed in a little more detail, or rebutted in detail, but seems like at that point they just wanted to get it to the jury.
Yeah. 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 Can I ask you a few questions? And I know that we'll share even more in detail on Patreon tonight. You have things to say. I have things to say. This has been a very difficult trial, to say the least. Go ahead.
I keep coming back. So just let's summarize what this case is. Like,
Okay.
putting aside all the persecution stuff and the state going after the little guy, all that, like, this case essentially hinges on, I mean, there's more, because as Gray Hughes would say, like, we can develop a picture from start to finish of presumably what happened, and the prosecution did that. Right, that he hides his car. He doesn't want, right? He takes a trail that's not typical. Why doesn't he park in them? There's a lot of things. We could present a narrative that's pretty compelling, I think, of Richard Allen, or somebody like Richard Allen, that ends up committing these murders. But in the end, if you boil this down to its essential components, this is a confession case with a bullet dropped in the middle of a crime scene. So you don't have DNA, but you have a bullet, which is the equivalent in this case of DNA. So that's what it comes down to. You've got 60 plus confessions and a magic bullet. Magic being that, I don't know, obviously the defense means that in a derogatory fashion, but as the prosecution points out, magic in the sense that without that bullet, you'd have a weaker case. You just have a confession case. But in the end, this comes down to the confessions and the bullet. That's essentially what you have. So, the question is, did the defense present a strong enough argument to discredit those confessions and to discredit the bullet, right? That's what they're trying to do.
Right. Exactly. Of course. Yeah. They are
And
yes.
and as I just said earlier, like if you have to, when you assess a false confession or any confession, you have to assess the motivations. What is the motive behind the confession? Is it, as I said earlier, if somebody's being tortured or coerced, or you've got the bad cop scenario where the bad cop spitting in your face and won't let you go to the bathroom, right? We've seen that in every true crime show. We've seen that in a lot of true crime shows, right? That's kind of the quintessential interrogation technique that has become famous or infamous in true crime shows. And those confessions, the motivation there is to alleviate the pressure. It's to get rid of the anxiety, right? It's to eliminate that pain that the person confessing is experiencing. And it's important to note that in those types of scenarios where there might be something closer to torture, in those types of scenarios, typically within 24 to 48 hours after a false confession, the confessor then retracts that confession when there's not as much pressure. We call that resolution. There's a lot of resolution in those cases. You don't have that here, right? If I keep going back to, and I don't know, I don't think the prosecution got into this, but I keep going back to what's his motivation in confessing. His motivation is cathartic. It's emotional. It's release. He wants peace of mind because he's feeling such turmoil and such guilt. That's his motive. His motive is not to try to alleviate his anxiety. He is someone who experiences a tremendous amount of anxiety, but he's not experiencing that anxiety because, the bad cops are coming to his cell every night and spitting in his face and telling him to confess. He's confessing to people he loves.
Yeah.
And I think that if you're going to discredit these confessions, I think you have to speak to that issue of motivation. If his motivation is to alleviate this guilt and to have this emotional release, this catharsis, because he's holding this, and I see this all the time, by the way, when I do interviews, I get confessions.
You do. You do.
Because the perpetrators at some level, human beings want to talk about what they did. It bothers them. I mean, unless it's like a true psychopath and there's no remorse and no guilt, then they don't care. Like, then they just go on killing rampages and they're totally indifferent. But Richard Allen is not a psychopath, or he doesn't appear to be. I wouldn't, nobody sees him that way. So he wants to alleviate this anxiety and this guilt that he's experiencing, and that's why he's confessing to his mother and his wife.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can, Dr. Martin basically said there was a very limited window when he was psychotic. So there's a very limited window of maybe a week or two where they put him on Haldol. But other than that, the vast majority of these confessions are occurring when he's not psychotic.
Correct.
And they're occurring with people he loves, which shows again that this is not a bad cop in his face. So if you're going to discredit these confessions, you better explain away his motivation. I need someone to tell me, if his motivation is catharsis, then you better explain why these are not accurate or honest.
Right. Right.
And I haven't heard anyone talk about that. So, I mean, if his if I'm right about his motivations, and I mean, people can argue against it, of course. People are. This case has obviously touched a nerve. People disagree with me. That's great. But sell it to me. Sell it to me that these confessions are not honest and accurate. Even though his motivations are that he wants to come clean and he wants to alleviate his guilt and he wants some type of catharsis. And more than anything, as he says repeatedly, he wants to be loved. And to answer that question, by the way, the expert who came on and talked about false memories, when he says, I did it, and his wife and his mother are saying, no, you didn't, don't say that, no, you didn't. And then he changes
Yeah.
it to I think I did it, because
Yeah.
he's dependent personality disorder.
Oh,
They're
this is
telling
helpful.
him it's not because his memory's changed, it's because now he's feeling some ambivalence. Because the people he loves the most, he wants approval from and validation from, are telling him, don't say that, don't say that, don't. So he's like, okay, you know what? I think maybe I did it. Like, he's starting to back up. He's starting to retract at that point.
Yeah.
Somebody's saying I'm fired up. Yeah, I'm fired. I am a little fired up because I want to stay with the evidence. I'm seeing some comments in chat, like, people are entitled to their opinion, but please align your opinion with evidence.
Well, we're getting a lot of good questions. Um, uh, I want to tell people, I met a couple people today, that have some interesting stories. I can't share them quite yet, but I hope to later. I hope they talk. Someone that knows Richard Allen, but today I met with someone named Kevin outside of the courtroom, and he did not know Richard Allen, but he shared with me, he did not want to go on camera. He shared with me that he actually spent time at Westville corrections facility. And so I asked him, he spent time there 10 years ago. And I asked them and I asked him and I said, oh, so what was it like? And he said, it's a horrible place. It's terrible. He goes, I was in Gen Pop and it was horrible. And I said, well, so what are you saying about Richard Allen? He goes, Richard Allen was treated like royalty. That's what he said today after court. I'm just sharing what somebody said. He said, to have all of the things he had, he was treated like royalty. And then he also said that he went into Westville Correctional Facility weighing 125 pounds and came out weighing 170 pounds because he had time to work out and he ate. The food wasn't that bad. So there you go. It's just one person, but
the other point on that issue, I don't know if he was treated like royalty. I don't know if anyone in solitary, and again, I don't know if that's even the right term, because it's not. It's a small,
right.
Confined space.
Yeah,
but
he's talking. He has social interaction daily.
Right, exactly. Solitary confinement is when somebody is isolated and doesn't have human contact. The real damage from solitary is when you don't have human contact. It's the lack of connection, social connection, that creates the problems. And there's all kinds of experiments and research showing that, but he's not isolated in that manner.
Right. And Miranda, he is talking about this. He is saying that keeping someone in solitary can be torturous, but what he's saying is the idea of the definition is to not have social interaction, and Richard Allen had it. So
for people that are familiar with the Harlow experiments, I talk about that sometimes, quite often. It has to do with monkeys that were the typical. Most people know the Harlow experiments with the wire cloth, kind of
yes.
the fake wire cloth.
When you were on a couple days ago, people wanted you to talk about that. They remembered you talking about that earlier, and they were like, why is this not the same thing, Dr. John? That was one of the questions. Yes. The cloth monkeys that were separated from their mothers. Yeah.
Correct. So there's another part of the Harlow experiment. So you have a part of the Harlow experiments where the monkeys are separated from mothers, and then they're given these wire mesh, like, stand-in figures. And
John, while you share this, I'm going to just grab a glass of water, but I'm listening. Okay. Okay. So keep sharing this and I'll be right back.
Yeah. So the purpose of the Harlow experiments was to examine whether monkeys were more drawn to food or to comfort, essentially. And the answer was, it turns out that they were typically drawn more towards comfort, and showing that they needed closeness. They needed that sense of attachment to something that seemed or felt like their mother's. But there's another part of the Harlow experiments that aren't talked about much, because they involve animal torture. But one of the things that Harlow did was he isolated monkeys. So he put monkeys in the equivalent of solitary confinement, and he had them and he had some monkeys in partial confinement, and they had some in full solitary. Solitary wasn't the term he used. He called it isolation. But what he found was that the monkeys, as you'd expect, the monkeys did really poorly in both conditions. And some of them stopped eating. Some of them died from the lack of interaction. It was an absolutely horrendous experiment, by the way, which would never occur today. But the key variable was the lack of interaction and contact with other monkeys.
Yes.
And so here, you can't really, like, the problem, if you're going to make that argument, the problem is you'd have to say he had contact with his family. He had contact with his therapist every day. He had contact with other people. Right. And so this is not the Harlow. This is not complete and total social isolation. If those monkeys, if those monkeys had some interaction with other monkeys, I'm sure he would have had a completely different outcome. So I think people kind of have this tunnel vision about what solitary is, and they perceive, like, they associate the word solitary confinement with torture. It depends on the situation. It might be torture. It can be to some people, and I'm sure Richard Allen felt psychologically, he felt emotionally like he was being tortured, because this is someone with dependent personality disorder who probably needs some social contact. And by the way, like, just to throw this out, like, there's very much a sense here in which the defense team is serving as his protector too. They're in very much of a parental role. Like, they're playing this role of, this gets to why, by the way, he wasn't allowed to confess, and why his wife and mother and the defense team would never allow him to confess. Because with dependent personality disorder, a lot of times you let other people make decisions for you. You let them take control. And so there's very much a sense in which the defense team is acting just like his mother and his wife. They're really infantilizing this guy. Right? They're really playing into that dependency, and they're telling him, no, we're going to take care of you. We're going to protect you. Don't worry about it. We're going to get you off. Right? I mean, without a defense team that's so aggressive, he probably would have taken a deal.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
So, yeah, somebody just said when her dad was in the Holy Den. Yeah, exactly. I mean, somebody else said, by the way, that when I'm talking about the whole, I'm talking about convicted felons. That's true for the most part.
Yeah.
But I mean, people need to know, like, you don't have to be convicted to sit in jail. The purpose of jail is that jail is a place where they hold someone who's potentially dangerous to the community, who's going to be tried for their crime. You don't let people out of jail before their trial, because they're a danger to the community.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, it sounds like some people think, oh, he has to be convicted. He should have been convicted to be held in solitary or jail or whatever. No, that's not true.
Okay.
Every criminal that's considered dangerous, or many criminals are denied, they're denied bail or bond, and the reason is because they're deemed to be too much of a danger to the community, and the judge or whoever's making that decision will not set them free before their trial because they could go on some kind of a killing spree. So when you're accused of murdering 2 young girls, you're not going to be set free in all likelihood. I mean, maybe some judge would make that determination, but for the most part, you're going to be held in jail because you're not convicted, but you're charged.
Mm-hmm.
You're charged and you're waiting trial. So I mean, that's not torture. That's the way the judicial system works.
Can I ask you a few questions?
Yeah.
There's some that you've answered that I had starred, but you answered on your own. So I'm removing those. Let's clarify this. So Dr. John is saying the doctors who said he wasn't faking it were wrong. I think we believe that he had some psychosis, just as the doctor stated. We believe he has dependent personality disorder. We believe that he wasn't malingering on his tests, which is actually showing how honest he is, which is what the doctor stated. And we believe the doctors who said the one day, Dr. Martin, who said the one day he had psychosis, then he gave him some drugs and monitored him, and then he did not have any psychosis for 7 weeks. I mean, so I don't know. Go ahead, John.
Well, let me answer that question. That's an important question. The answer is that it's complex. And what I mean by that is that if you let's take a high profile case like Jeffrey Dahmer. So Dahmer was assessed by and Dahmer would be an extreme example, right? That's why I'm using him. Dahmer was, his defense team was looking for an insanity plea. And so he was assessed by 7 of the most qualified, highest profile psychologists you could bring in. 7. They were split evenly in terms of 4 said that he was that he would qualify for insanity, and 3 said that he wasn't. And so they were looking at the same things. Was Jeffrey Dahmer psychotic to do what he did? Did he have a personality disorder, right? Like, that's what forensic people do. That's what my profession does. And you'll see this a lot in high profile cases where forensic psychologists and psychiatrists will not come to the same conclusions. They'll have the same data, but they'll see it differently. So this question of malingering is very complex, and it depends on who does the assessment. It depends on if they have biases. It depends on what tests they use. It depends on who they interview. Somebody wrote us, I don't know if this is true, but somebody wrote and said that, here's an example. Somebody said that before, one of the guards said that before, apparently, I don't know if this is accurate, I'm just repeating what somebody wrote, that one of the guards apparently observed that before Richard Allen drank water from the toilet, which is one of the things he did, that he hesitated and that he had to steel himself. He had to, you could see him pausing before he did it and trying to motivate himself to do it. And so your mic's off. And I just said
that's interesting. You've been checking emails. I haven't. I didn't even know received this email. Okay.
So I don't know if that's accurate, but let's just use that as an example. So if, let's say I'm reviewing video of Richard Allen in prison, which I would do, I would want to look at a lot of scenarios like that to see do you see these moments where Allen is let's say he did that, right? That would show that he doesn't want to do it, that there's an avoidance there, right? That he's doing it for a purpose, and the purpose is to present himself as being more psychotic or more mentally ill than he might be. right? He's clearly doing, if he doesn't want to drink the water, the toilet water, and he drinks it, then that's a type of malingering, right? And the question is, when you have hundreds and hundreds of hours of these types of scenarios, like, how closely is someone looking at that? Are they going to see those moments? Some people may see them, some people won't, right? And some of it depends on whether you're hired by the prosecution or the defense to find those moments. Because typically there's going to be if you're coming in for the defense, I'd like to say that forensic psychologists are not biased, but we're human beings. And if we're coming in for the defense and they're paying us and they want us to find, I mean, I'll tell lawyers, I'll say, look, I'm going to be neutral. I'm going to find what I find. You may not like it, but that's what I'm going to do, right? But even given that, you come in with the bias and you may not pick up on those moments because they go against the narrative that the people hiring you want. So I don't know if Richard Allen did that. Somebody wrote and said that, and I haven't found where that is on any, like, I don't have access to the video to confirm that. So, but it's an example of how complex this issue is. You can have 4 experts on each side given the job of assessing whether someone is malingering, and you'll get completely different opinions. That happened in Dahmer. That happens in so many high-profile cases where people,
David Mitchell,
experts present for the defense, experts present for the prosecution. Some say that someone meets the criteria for insanity. Some say he doesn't. So is it settled that he was malingering or not? I don't know. I mean, technically, you'd probably have to spend hundreds and hundreds of hours. It's interesting that what Dr. Westcott, for example, was hired by the defense to assess his mental health. She wasn't hired, by the way, to assess malingering. She was hired to assess his mental health. She spent, all told, I think you said she spent 5 hours interviewing him. 5 hours is nothing. 5 hours. Depending on the case and how the level of importance of the case, I might spend upwards of 20 to 30 hours just doing interviews. So 5 hours is that's like not even a full day of interviewing. And that's not to say she can't render an accurate opinion. I'm just saying, the defense probably limited her hours and say, we're paying you for 40 hours, which means she's got to write a report. She's got to do an interview. She has to do testing. She had some of her assistants help with testing, but it's still part of those hours, right? So there's no definitive answer in terms of whether he's malingering. The best, if you want to know, so one of the things that I say about, with sex offenders that I've worked with, a lot of them have to take polygraph exams. Many of them refuse it, but some don't. And people say, well, polygraphs aren't accurate. I mean, they can be. My experience is they can be very accurate. But I always tell people, if you want to know, whether a felon committed a crime, a sex offender or a murder or any felon, the best way to find out is to have them tell you if they're honest about it. So a sex offender that says, you know what, I passed my poly, but I committed the crime, I'm going to believe the felon.
Yeah, interesting. Right. That makes
right?
sense.
Like the best way to know whether someone is guilty or innocent is to ask them. It's that simple. And guess what? So if you want to know about malingering, ask him. Here's what Richard Allen told Dr. Walla. You just said this. He said, quote, "I'm not crazy. I'm only acting like that."
He did say
so
that.
Ask Richard Allen. Richard Allen just told us that he's malingering, essentially. So if I'm doing an assessment of Richard Allen and I have that statement and that report in front of me, you better believe that's going to be in my report. So when I'm reaching conclusions about that particular issue, I am going to use Richard Allen. If he's telling me he's malingering, I'm going to believe him.
Really quickly, I want to ask this by Vet Girl and Laura. Thank you so much to everybody's been so kind and generous. She said she's not either way, but what happens with POWs isolated when they admit when there is no wrongdoing? So people want to talk false confessions. What happens when there is a false confession from like a POW that's isolated? Dependent people want to be able to contact loved ones to get out of isolation. Please and thanks. Isn't that kind of what like Richard Allen? Well, go ahead. But I mean, Richard Allen's wife didn't want him to confess, and neither did his mother.
Yeah.
So
Right.
he is a dependent person, but then he would say to them, I didn't do it. Is that, I don't know. Or what's the difference? You respond here. Sorry.
Well, POWs are, I mean, POWs are being tortured for the not always, but a lot of times they're being tortured and they don't have any contact with other POWs. So you can get POWs to say a lot of things they don't want to say. Like, in Vietnam, they would say that I'm loyal to the Viet Cong, right? Like but that's complete. I mean, to compare Richard Allen to a POW is a little extreme.
Right. Judy Ron says the same thing. Richard Allen and POWs are two different things.
Yeah. POWs don't have access to TV. They're not watching, they're not watching reruns of The Walking Dead. So, or whatever, they're not watching reruns of The Simpsons.
Yeah. Speaking, Duty Ron, I really appreciated your text earlier today. It meant a lot to me. Thank you. Here's a question that people have, and I want to ask it too. Well, first off, I kind of like this. Will a sequestered jury sympathize with confinement? I was like, wow.
Well, I presume a sequestered jury is not being put on a medieval torture rack.
No, but what if they're going crazy without their electronics tonight,
right,
like I do in the courtroom?
Well, Richard Allen had a tablet. I mean,
they Richard have a Allen TV.
He had a tablet. I think he actually refused television, but he was given television privileges that he didn't accept.
Yeah. Okay. There are some interesting questions here.
Okay.
Why do this at age 45? Why not earlier in life?
Well, so yeah. So, before I answer that question.
Yeah, that's a total change in topic. So yeah.
It's interesting to me. Richard, I talked about this in our pre-trial show.
You did.
That Richard Allen had, the police showed up at his house because his wife had made a call that there was a domestic violence incident in the home.
This actually came up in court, and we learned that he was institutionalized after he was suicidal that night, and he was institutionalized after this call, hospitalized.
Okay, right. So yeah. Here's the point is that he doesn't have a criminal record because he was never charged with that.
Yeah.
In other words, the question here is part of the question, I think, is how could someone without, because I actually, there was a documentary I saw on this case where one of my colleagues made a comment that she didn't think Richard Allen could do it because he didn't have a criminal history or violent history. And I'm like, no, that's
well. Let me share one thing I've learned recently about Richard Allen. In speaking to somebody who knew him, that perhaps he lost a job due to his inappropriate relationships with women, and I'm going to confirm that. I mean, I spoke to someone that knows him, but I'm going to do more research on this. But yeah, there are a lot of people coming forward that have some interesting stories that they're saying about Richard Allen.
Yeah. So I think the answer here is that, number one, either he wasn't caught, he might have engaged in some illegal behaviors previously, whatever, maybe sexual, I don't know. where he wouldn't have a criminal record because he wasn't caught or charged in any way. So I mean, you could say that he was starting earlier in life. It was off the radar, and it was off the radar of law enforcement, so you would never see it. It's not like it's not like there weren't issues. As we talked about, there's some evidence that he was sexually abused. He's a self-described sex addict, which means that he's probably having a lot of sexual fantasies about many things. And I can tell you from working with a lot of sex offenders that obviously it's a problem when somebody commits a sexual offense, but the problem begins way before that. It begins with what we would call deviant sexual fantasies, meaning illegal fantasies of engaging in things that are non-consensual, fantasies of engaging in activities that are illegal, essentially. And so my guess is that Richard Allen is having a lot of these deviant fantasies much earlier in life. He basically says that in his confessions. He says that his goal was to commit an assault, and it went south, and then he ended up murdering the 2 victims. But it begins with this fantasy of assault. And my guess is that those fantasies existed for many years, going back to childhood. So what you see the consequence of that at age 45, but you're building up to it. And also, one of the things that Dr. Westcott found was that he had these obsessive qualities where he couldn't let topics go.
It was actually Dr. Westcott that found this, and Dr. Westcott is the defense's witness. She had obsessive qualities.
He had obsessive qualities. So when you put together someone who can't, to use Dr. Westcott's language, can't let go of the topic, and is a self-described sex addict, that's a potential prescription for disaster, in the sense that my guess is Allen is having these deviant sexual fantasies for many, many years. He's not acting on them. Or if he is acting on them, he's not getting caught. So a lot of sex offenders have a lot of victims. They leave a trail of victims that don't talk, that don't disclose. And so that's possible here. I don't know. It doesn't seem necessarily that way. I guess my guess is some of those victims may have come forward at this point, but maybe not if they don't feel safe. So you have this obsessive quality where he can't let go of things. He can't let go of topics. He can't switch his thoughts to something else. So my guess is Richard Allen, as a self-described sex addict, his words, he's probably having a lot of these deviant fantasies that involve the R word, that involve assault, and whatever propels him or leads him to act on those fantasies at age 45, we don't know. Was there a trigger? Probably. I don't know what it is. If I had to guess, my guess is that his wife, he probably was in an argument with his wife, probably had something to do with separation or rejection from his wife. And I can create a scenario where
his daughter was getting engaged too. Not that we don't know anything. She was already gone from home. I'm not implying that, but there's changes in his life. He has anxiety. He has stress. He has stressors with work.
Right. A combination of some triggers and these escalating sexual fantasy, deviant sexual fantasies that he can't get rid of, that are part of this obsessive quality he seems to have. I think that's eventually what puts him on that trail. And you did video of the trail. It yes. Puts him on that trail, which, by the way, like, someone with pure motivations is going to park in the normal Mona and High Bridge parking lot, and they're going to take the normal trail to the Mona and High Bridge, right? He doesn't. He parks in the old Child Protective Services building. He hides his car. He hides his license plate. He gets on a trail that is off the beaten path. It's not taken, right? He's not walking into that scenario in a normal fashion. He's right. He doesn't want to be seen. And the defense mocking this idea of him lying in wait. Well, they're being too literal. I mean, he's waiting for someone. My guess is he's waiting for victims who happen to be, unfortunately, they happen to be, Libby and Abby. But my guess is he's on this kind of clandestine, off the beaten path trail, and he's sitting. He can observe the bridge. He can observe the surroundings. He's waiting to see if he can isolate a couple of victims on the Monon High Bridge. And when he sees, so is he lying in wait? Yeah, in some sense he is. When he sees the girls crossing, he knows he can corner them down the hill. If you think, so we know that Richard Allen is there. We know he's on this off the beaten path trail. Like, why is he doing that? To me, you have to look at the entire narrative, right? You have to look at, people want to just take bits and pieces and say, the other thing that he says is he was there, he got on the Monon High Bridge to watch the fish.
I could see Clearwater, by the way. Don't get into the fish. People have been on you about the fish, man.
No, but here's my point. No, I know that. You can see fish from, I know that. You can see fish from the Monon High Bridge. But that's missing the point. My point is, given what we know about Richard Allen, is that a reasonable motivation? If you want to watch the fish, you're gonna hike down to the river. You're not gonna, right? Why would you go up on the Monon High Bridge, which is falling apart, which is deteriorating, where the risks are, you could fall off the bridge or fall through the bridge, right? Like at that time before they fixed it. Like, is that a reasonable motivation? Is that believable? When you put all these pieces together, he's on and off. He's parking not to be seen. He's on a trail not to be seen. He's telling police, I'm there to watch fish. Well, then why are you going on this clandestine trail? If you're there to watch fish, you don't even need to get on the bridge. Just go down to the river and watch fish. I mean, just put it together. What's the narrative here, right? Like, what makes the most sense? I saw somebody said earlier, it's Occam's razor. Yes, Occam's razor. Occam's razor is, in science, it's mostly a scientific term, but it's also, I'm sure, a term in law enforcement. Occam's razor is, you go with the most simplistic, elegant solution. When you start adding in all this clutter and start adding in all this peripheral stuff like Odinism, then you're getting away from the narrative that makes the most sense, that would explain something in the most simplistic and straightforward and logical fashion. What does Occam's razor say about this? Does it make any sense that someone would get on a trail where they're not seen and that's rarely used and park in an area that no one ever parks in to watch fish?
Some people say yes. He was a fisher.
Yeah, of course.
He was a fisherman. But you're saying something's fishy. Despite his love of fishing, something's fishy here. You will not let the fish alibi go. You will not.
It doesn't fit. It doesn't fit the larger narrative here. He's not going on that trail to watch fish. He's going on that trail because he told us why he's going on that trail.
Well,
he told us.
I think it actually is more symbolic. I think in many ways he was going to watch fish. What do fish represent? He was going to watch for two. He fishes.
Wait,
he's going to watch for two unsuspecting.
Pre or post Jesus?
I'm talking about the moment on the bridge. What he said. I'm just trying to say what it represents. Two, I know Jesus. This is before Jesus. So on the bridge.
Right. So
yeah.
So
he's not.
So
he's a fish. He fishes. He likes to catch fish. He's on the bridge. He's saying he's looking for fish. It was an easy. Let me just. But hold on. Ahead. Like, what are fish? What is he really looking for? He's looking for something on the bridge. Mm-hmm. He is fishing, but is he really fishing for fish? What is he looking for? Is he looking for two unsuspecting little girls? It's a metaphor.
Catching fish is a metaphor for preying on two young girls. Right. I get it. But he's a literal guy. Let's take him at face value.
Okay, literal guy.
If
Okay.
if let's take him at face value. I mean, you're right. I think there is something symbolic about going to watch fish. He is. He's watching. You're right. I
Thank you.
agree. Symbolically, he's saying, I'm there to catch fish.
Yeah.
Right. Fish being whatever, however you want to take that. But let's take him literally. You're not going to fish from, how high up is it? 60 feet? This
65
isn't like,
feet. Yeah.
you know, when I was a kid, I used to fish with my grandfather off of like a little bridge in Florida. And like, but it was in, we would fish not in a little creek. We would fish in like a tidal pool that was coming in from the ocean. It was like, a big fishing area. And I think the bridge may have been, I don't know, 20 feet up or something. It wasn't super high up, but it was up. Like, would somebody reasonably fish on a bridge that's crumbling and deteriorating, that's a high risk to fall through with no guardrails? Like, he didn't have a fishing pole. I don't know. I'm just pointing out my larger point here is there is a story about how and why these murders happened. That story should make sense. It should be coherent. It should fit his motives. It should fit all of it. You have to be able to tell that story in a way that makes the most sense. Occam's razor. If you can't tell that story in a way that makes the most sense, then it probably isn't the accurate story. But everything about this story, from Richard Allen telling us he's there at the time of the murders, he's on this off the beaten path trail.
Mm-hmm.
He's on a trail where he can see the bridge, and he can see people coming and going from the bridge. Right? He is lying in wait in a sense. Why isn't he doing that on the normal trail? Because he doesn't want to be caught. He doesn't want to be identified.
Here's a question, and we should probably jump on Patreon soon too. But well, you're gonna have to go soon. But
yeah.
A lot of talk. So this is an interesting thing for me because I sat through all, I think I missed a day and a half when I came home for Halloween. But I sat through Dr. Walla's testimony and her cross. And I've talked to you about it. They say, Dr. Walla discusses the case and the online theories with Richard Allen. Everything she says holds no weight for the unethical way she practices. We sort of talked about this on Patreon, but
yeah,
she was very, I don't know. People are having issues, I think, with her knowing about listening to podcasts while treating Richard Allen.
Let me just clear. Yeah, so Dr. Walla's job, she was treating Richard Allen. In other words, she was in the clinical role. She was his therapist. Her job as a therapist is to provide support and help to Richard Allen. She was not in the role. So the role I might typically occupy is as a forensic psychologist, which is to assess. The role of a forensic psychologist means you're not in a clinical role. Your job is to be objective and to provide objective assessments and to do testing and to try to maintain neutrality. That's not true of someone in a clinical role. In fact, it can be the opposite. Somebody in a clinical role is not there to question their client. They're not there to assess the validity or truthfulness of what a client says. I get this question. So I supervise students. I've supervised students for many years. I'm an adjunct professor at UNLV, and I've been there for a long time. And I get this question all the time. So from young clinicians who they have a client come in and they say, well, my client's lying. I know they're lying. Shouldn't I call them out on it? I'm like, no, like your job is to work within their worldview. Your job is to help them understand whatever problem they're bringing in, whatever their presenting problem is. Your job is to work within the confines of that. It's not to tell them that they're lying, right? And the same is true with Dr. Walla and Richard Allen. her job is not to call him out or to question his truthfulness about anything. Her job is to listen and support him and to help him emotionally and psychologically. So if she's listening to true crime podcasts or learning more about the case or whatever she's doing, the only issue with that becomes, does that impede her ability to be helpful and therapeutic to Richard Allen? Because that's her job. If it does, then it's a problem. If it doesn't, then she's doing her job. So, I mean, can she consume true crime when she's not at work or not with? Yeah, she can. That's not unethical. If she was in the role of a forensic psychologist and her job was to provide objective assessment, that would be a big problem.
So if Dr. Westcott was doing this, it would be a problem.
Right. If Dr. Westcott was his therapist and doing the
evaluation
assessment, evaluation, doing a forensic assessment of his mental health, that would be unethical. That would be highly dubious, and any findings she would have on her forensic assessment would be questionable. Dr. Walla, she's doing her job. She's not doing anything. I mean, is it ideal? Is it ideal that she's investigating the Delphi murders and Richard? I mean, if it compromises her ability to be therapeutic, it's a problem. If it doesn't, then it's probably not a problem. And actually, she says, she's telling him, don't talk to people. She's actually trying to help him.
She is.
She's telling him, don't talk to people. Don't confess to people. She's ironically, she's doing exactly what she's supposed to do. She's supporting him.
Yeah. And she told him through listening to a podcast, she said, I just want you to know that there's a lot of people that support you. And she said she was trying to give him hope.
So this whole thing about Dr. Walla being unethical and losing her license, and I don't know, this is a misunderstanding of her role.
Nana of 7, I know you have to leave soon. Nana of 7, thank you so much for your support. Thank you, everyone, for your support tonight. It's been so kind. Richard Allen seems like he was always sort of a fragile individual. I agree with that. If he had anxiety and obsessive dependent behavior, how in the world would he not be sent into psychosis by his own actions and hiding it for 5 years? Seems like he could not do that.
Yeah, I agree.
I agree too.
Richard Allen, I've said this previously many times, that he has his lawyer, excuse me, he has his lawyers and his wife and his mother basically saying, shut up. And yet all he wants to do is talk. And so you have this tremendous conflict in Richard Allen. I think that you have this turmoil that must be just eating him alive, in terms of he wants to really get this off his chest, but everyone's telling him, no, don't do it. And because he's dependent personality disorder, he's going to, take most of his cues from other people. He doesn't want to disappoint them. He wants to please people. Dependent personality disorders are like the ultimate people pleasers. So if his wife tells him no, he's going to be like, okay. And so this is creating a tremendous amount of guilt and turmoil in him. I think he's really torn. He's really torn by this conflict that he's getting from all sides, and he's kind of put in the middle of this, and that could easily lead to a lot of symptoms.
Mm-hmm.
That could easily lead to some psychotic symptoms, or whatever his mental health issues are. They're going to be amplified by that. So the way I've described it is, I think there's almost a masochistic component, in the sense that like the feces and the hitting his head against the wall. These types of self-harming behaviors, I think, are in part maybe driven. If they're not totally malingering, they're driven by this turmoil that he's feeling. He's acting masochistically because he doesn't know what else to do with his anxiety and his turmoil. He's harming himself because he feels like he doesn't have any other options. He doesn't have any way to kind of to cope with this anxiety he's experiencing. And guilt, the guilt is just driving him crazy, apparently, right? That's one of the reasons why he wants to confess so much.
Mm-hmm. He says he feels guilt. Like he's not, this is not
true psychopath. This is a guy who has guilt and shame and potentially remorse if anyone would let him talk.
Yeah.
if
I know you have to
he,
go soon. You have to go soon. Sean, thank you. Does Dr. John find it strange he picked 2 victims for this kind of first attack?
yeah, yeah, that's if I had to guess, I think it's possible that, not to go too far with this analogy, but like Brian Koberger, and I don't know, Koberger hasn't been tried, so right now he's innocent until proven guilty. But I think it's quite possible that Richard Allen targeted one of the girls,
Hmm.
and that I think he may not have realized that there were two people there on the bridge until it was too late. So I think it's highly possible that for whatever reasons he thought there was only one girl, and he was going to isolate her and attack her. And at some point, obviously, he learned otherwise, and that made matters more complicated. But at some point, I think he felt like he was all in spite of the fact that there were two people present. And I think Koberger, same thing. Koberger seems to have targeted one of his victims, and he didn't know that there were 2 people in that bedroom.
Yeah. Neither of these 2 men convicted of any crime. So innocent until proven guilty,
Right.
but with the
Yeah.
theory that is being presented with their charges. And thank you, Beth. I think you did just kind of answer that, potential abandonment, were Richard Allen's confessions the result of unbearable anxiety over potential abandonment, a self-fulfilling prophecy, oddly enough.
Yeah, I think that, and again, I think in assessing this case, I think maybe the most important element is to look at his motivations for the confessions. And it seems to me, if you look closely at those confessions, it seems to me that he's confessing because he wants to find some catharsis and some peace of mind. And so, yes, I agree with that observation. The anxiety, but right, and because he's doing it for that, because those are his motivations, I think that makes those confessions completely valid.
Yeah. You said at the beginning of this, because I know you have to leave, that whenever you ask criminals, they say they don't know why they did something. And we don't know whether Richard Allen will be found guilty or not. But if this is him confessing and his confessions are real, and he has said multiple times, I don't know why I did it.
Mhm.
Why do you? And let me preface this too. John has read everything possible. I want everyone to know how much John has studied this case. We don't take cases we cover lightly. John has gone through everything. And I've been sharing with him, even if he hasn't been there every day of the trial with me. He knows so much. And you can look at our previous coverage of this before the trial too. Why do you think then, from what you know, did Richard Allen do this? If he is found guilty, if he is guilty of this crime, why? To answer his own question.
He's partially telling us why. It's a sexually motivated crime, right? He's acknowledging that. He says that in his confessions. He's right. He wants to commit an assault.
Yeah. So this was his desire. Yeah, he said he wanted to assault them, and then said he was selfish and chose to end their lives to save his. Is what he allegedly said to. That is what Dr. Walla recorded in her notes.
He could have, and meaning that he could have. I've thought about this too. He could have just he could have committed the crime and let them go, but then obviously, as he said, he knows he would have been caught. He would have been convicted because there would have been 2 eyewitnesses that survived. They would have identified him right away, and he'd spend the rest of his life in prison.
Yeah.
So yeah, you take him at his word. He's being literal. He's telling you right. He committed murder. He probably didn't intend to commit murder, but he commits murder because he wants to be free.
Okay. He wants to be free.
He had to make a choice. He knew that if let's say he was successful with the sex crime, right? Then and he lets them go. Then he knows at that point that he's going to prison probably. I mean, he he might try to fight it. I'm sure he'd hire the same defense team, but and they might work some magic and cast some doubt on it. I don't know, but if the victims, if he lets them go, if he commits a sex crime, and which happens a lot, by the way, that victims of sexual assault, many times they're not murdered, and so if they get away, more than likely they're going to ID him, and he's going to get convicted, and he's going to spend, at a minimum, he's probably going to spend 20 to 30 years in prison.
And Nancy, yes, you just sort of answered Nancy's question, but yes, what Dr. John said. Nancy, yes, perhaps his key motivation. Oh, violent. I see what you're saying. Could it have been violent fantasies?
Yeah.
She
So when I talked about sexual fantasies, I mentioned the term. So the term we use with sex offenders is deviant sexual fantasies. That means violent, non-consensual, aberrant sexual behavior, such as bestiality, right? Like things that are illegal, sexual behavior that wouldn't be considered the norm, that would typically be against the law. And again, I think what's driving this crime is precisely that this is someone who's having a lot of deviant sexual fantasies. He can't contain those. He's obsessing over them. Again, he's a self-described sex addict. And the reason he lands on that trail and on that bridge is because he's acting out those sexual fantasies.
Thank you. There was one more. Thank you, everyone, for all your questions. We appreciate, again, all the kindness. Thank you, Judy Ron. Thank you to Pat Brooks. Where is it? Well, it was a question for me. So let's see if I can find it. She, I don't know where it is, but somebody asked, I don't know. Someone asked how I was holding up, and I am doing okay. I want you to know I'm going to sleep well tonight.
I'm gonna make a comment that you're doing okay, but you're probably a little sleep deprived and exhausted, and
Yeah.
you've been working so hard, and thank you for your commitment, because there's so few people that are being allowed to go into that courtroom, and it seems like some of the information coming out is skewed. So
yeah, and I always say
important.
too, I also have not gotten everything right. We're doing our best in there with our paper and our pens, but one day the transcripts will come out and we can all read. But I want you guys to know I'm doing my best, and I'm trying. I have tried to be factual with all the evidence, and I've done my best. So thank you, everyone, for trusting me. Yeah. So we'll see. The jury continues to deliberate tomorrow. A big thank you again to our line sitters, Julie, Ginny, and gosh, Red and Ted. So thank you, everyone. All right. You need to run. We have 10,000 people watching. We have had 10,000 people with us. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Any final thoughts or questions or anything?
I mean, there are a
You want
lot
me
of
to-
questions. I just know you have to run, but let's see if there's any. Let's see. I slowed the chat down so much, and it is still going so fast. I mean,
I just want to
I don't
say
know if we have
this
time for that one, but go ahead.
before I jump off here. The question that I was asking on Patreon that I want to reiterate here is, and again, I want to point out that oftentimes in these types of cases, in confession cases, if you get one confession, let's take the case of Chris Watts. Chris Watts confessed.
He did, and it
He
was very
confessed to his
compelling.
father. He confessed one time. It was on video, and he took a plea deal. He was convicted on his confession. He didn't have to confess 60 times.
No, he didn't.
Like, how many times do you need to confess? Like, this, I want to point out, this is unusual to get this many confessions, especially when the motivations are pure, meaning that he's doing it for peace of mind and to alleviate his guilt. Chris Watts you will often get convictions. Juries like confessions. You will often get convictions with one or two confessions. And so it's mind-boggling to me that here you have a guy with pure intentions who's given us 60 plus confessions, and people are like, I don't know. And so the question I have is, why don't people believe him? I mean, some of the answer is, I think that, it's the way information is being presented on this case for sure. But
Because someone pointed out, Chris Watts' dad believed him. Richard Allen can't get anyone to believe him.
Right. Thank you for saying that. Exactly. Chris Watts. Exactly. Chris
And
Watts.
now Brenda's saying, I believe you, Richard.
Chris Watts' dad was like, son, that's a horrible thing. You better, I can't believe you did that. I still love you, but you better take a deal. Right? We're right, exactly. Whereas the people in Richard Allen must be as shocked as anyone. The people in Richard Allen's universe are like, no, you did it. No, you didn't. Oh, okay, maybe I didn't. I don't know. I mean, exactly. If his wife said, you murdered two young, innocent, beautiful victims, you need to take responsibility for that. We wouldn't be talking right now if somebody did that.
One last question. Oh, go ahead.
But here we are in a position where 50-50, right? Like, it seems like people were really split on this case. 50-50 that he goes free.
Depends on the poll and where it is. So according to Web Sleuth, they're doing polls daily, hundreds of people answering them. They think 80% think Richard Allen's guilty. Vinny Politan's doing a poll over on his channel, and the majority of people think he's not guilty. So
it depends on the audience, yeah. But I that's the question. So by the way, I said this on Patreon, but the answer to that question of why people don't believe him is, we just scratched the surface of answering that. I want to answer that because that's really the key to this case, I think. Because if his wife and mother believed him and said to him essentially, look, go tell law enforcement on video what you did, take responsibility for this, do the time, because you just destroyed the lives of several families of young girls that had their whole lives ahead of them, right? Like, this would be completely different. So, and I don't want to forget that, by the way. Like, the reason you're there is to give a voice to these victims. We just didn't think it would be this hard.
No. When I heard that there was no audio and no video, I thought someone ought to be there to share what was going on. So I did my best. So that's what I set out to do. Let's just do my best, and I hope it was of help.
And
Maybe.
let me say this too, because I know we're going to get this question. I don't know if people are talking about this yet, but Richard Allen is a self-described sex addict. Just because you're a sex addict doesn't mean you're going to go out and commit a sex crime,
No.
right?
Or have
and
a sexual
OCD,
disorder, because you say
I
sex
always-
addict isn't even the DSM, but yes.
Right, it's not even and also OCD. Just because you have some qualities or traits of OCD doesn't mean you're going to go commit a crime. I get these emails all the time, like, "Oh, John, you said you mentioned OCD, and then he couldn't let go of these fantasies." But I have OCD, and I don't have any violent tendencies. Yeah, I'm not talking about it in that context. What I want to clarify with that is that it's not the sex addiction that's a problem. It's the deviant, potentially violent sexual fantasies that lead to these murders. It's the aberrations that lead to murder. It's not, if somebody's a sex addict and they're having, let's say, normal sexual fantasies and they can't control it, it's not going to lead to murder. It's the violent ideation that accompanies it. It's the other parts of this, the non-consensual parts. And then the OCD comes in because he can't let it go. If he has some capacity to cope with those deviant, violent sexual fantasies, then it probably doesn't land. It probably doesn't end up in murder, right? So it's just to clarify, it's the nature of those fantasies that's creating the problems here. And this is true of murder in general too. People say, well, mental illness doesn't mean that someone's going to commit murder, and that's absolutely true.
But I saw this one, and I had to throw up prolific scholars because we've already covered John Mark Carr. I thought let's end on that. You got to go.
Yeah,
we have a child.
Right. We talked about John Mark Carr. John Mark Carr is an example of what's called a voluntary false confession, and but this is different in the sense that John Mark Carr's motivations were attention seeking and fame, I guess, to some degree. Like he wanted to be seen and known for apparently for committing that crime, whereas Richard Allen's confessions, he doesn't want notoriety. He doesn't want attention. He wants peace of mind. So the motive, again, I think it's really important when you talk about confessions to look at the motives. Why is someone confessing? What's their motive? In a coercive situation, as I said earlier, the motive is to alleviate that pressure, to alleviate the suffering they're experiencing when they have, law enforcement in their face or whatever. It's a very different motive.
Yeah. Well, guys, we'll go take a poll too. We'll do the hidden true crime poll over on our community. You've got to go, John. And
I need to run.
You need to run. You go. You can just leave. We'll see you.
All right. Thanks, guys. I appreciate it. And
we'll see ya.
Try to get some sleep tonight if you can.
I'll do my best.
If you dare.
We'll see you.
All right.
Okay.
All right. Take care.
Bye. Love
Bye,
you.
guys.
I just want to say thank you to all of the people that are disagreeing with us in our chat. I always say that. Surround yourself with people who disagree with you. And thank you for listening and sharing what we're thinking. Or what John is thinking, and I'm listening and learning with all of you. All right, guys, we'll see you. I will go do a poll. Let's find out. Let's find out what our listeners are thinking. I am very curious. And I'll see you guys tomorrow during Verdict Watch. I'll be over at the courthouse and I'll go live from there. Thank you so much. We'll see you. Bye-bye.